You think isolation is peace, but tonight, we'll show you how loneliness turns deadly inside the lighthouse. The ancient stones of Ravenshore Lighthouse had witnessed more than 2 centuries of storms, shipwrecks, and solitary guardians. Built in 1798, on the jagged cliffs of Scotland's most treacherous coastline, it stood like a skeletal finger, pointing accusingly at the heavens. The locals in the village below had always whispered something was wrong with that place, but they could never quite put their finger on what. Dr. Catherine Blackwood, a maritime historian from Oxford, had come to catalogue the lighthouse's historical artifacts. The structure was scheduled for demolition. The Scottish Heritage Foundation had finally declared it unsafe. After decades of neglect, what she discovered in the keeper's quarters would change everything. Everything she thought she knew about the human mind and the darkness that lurked beneath the waves. The lighthouse stood empty now, its automated beacon still sweeping across the treacherous waters each night. But Catherine wasn't alone. As she climbed the winding stone steps to the keeper's quarters, something was watching her from the shadows between the light's rotations, something that had been waiting patiently for decades. The first journal she found was leather-bound and worn, filled with the meticulous handwriting of William Morrison, the lighthouse's final keeper. His entries began normally enough, documenting routine maintenance and weather conditions. But as Catherine read deeper into the night, the words began to reveal something else, a horrifying truth that had been hidden for generations. Morrison wrote about the isolation at first, how the endless crash of waves against the rocks below became a maddening rhythm that invaded his dreams. He described finding strange objects hidden throughout the lighthouse, carved symbols in the stone walls, bundles of kelp arranged in ritualistic patterns, and most disturbing of all, a wooden box containing dozens of human teeth. The teeth weren't old relics from some forgotten tragedy. They were fresh, recently extracted, and arranged with careful precision. Some bore the marks of tools. Others appeared to have been pulled by hand. Morrison's handwriting became increasingly erratic as he described his growing obsession with the collection, how he found himself counting them obsessively each night before the beacon began its sweep. But it was the voices that truly began his descent into madness. At first, they came only during the darkest hours before dawn, whispers carried on the salt wind that spoke his name with intimate familiarity. Morrison convinced himself they were auditory hallucinations brought on by isolation, but the voices knew things about his past that no phantom should know. They spoke of his childhood in Glasgow, his failed marriage to Janet, his secret shame about the accident that had killed his younger brother, Douglas. As weeks turned to months, the voices grew bolder. They began speaking during daylight hours, emanating from the lighthouse beam itself. As it cut through the coastal fog, Morrison wrote frantically about conversations with entities that claimed to be the drowned souls of every ship that had wrecked on these shores. Over the centuries, they told him stories of their final moments, the taste of salt water filling their lungs, the crushing pressure of the depths claiming their bodies. The voices belonged to Captain Robert Sterling of the merchant vessel Cordelia, lost in 1923. With all hands aboard, they spoke with the accent of Margaret O'Brien, a young Irish girl who had drowned trying to reach shore from a refugee ship in 1847. Most terrifying of all was the voice that claimed to be Thomas Blackthorne, a colonial soldier who had been shipwrecked here in 1743 while carrying dispatches to the Highland regiments. Each spirit told Morrison the same thing. They were trapped in the waters below, unable to rest, until someone joined them, willingly. The lighthouse, they explained, was built on an ancient, sacrificial site, where Celtic druids had once offered human lives to the sea gods. The light itself was cursed, serving as a beacon, not just for ships, but for the restless dead, who dwelt in the crushing darkness beneath the waves. Morrison's journal entries became increasingly frantic, as he described his growing compulsion to visit the lighthouse gallery. During the beacon's rotation, the spirits showed him visions in the light, ghostly figures, standing waist-deep in the churning waters below, their arms outstretched in welcome. He could see their faces clearly now, pale and bloated from years underwater, but their expressions were not of anguish. They smiled with peaceful contentment, as if death had finally freed them from some unbearable burden. The truth that Morrison discovered in his final weeks was more horrifying than mere hauntings. Hidden in the lighthouse's foundation stones, he found journals from every keeper who had served at Ravensshore over 2 centuries. Each man had experienced the same progression: isolation, voices, visions, and finally, an irresistible urge to join the drowned congregation below. But they didn't simply throw themselves from the cliffs in despair. The ritual was far more deliberate. Each keeper, in his final days, began extracting his own teeth, one by one, adding them to the collection that had been growing for generations. The pain, Morrison wrote, was a necessary purification, a way of demonstrating his worthiness to join the underwater community that called to him. Each night, the teeth served another purpose as well. They were anchors, physical connections, to the world of the living that had to be severed before a soul could fully cross over to the realm of the drowned. Each extracted tooth weakened the barrier between life and death, making the transition easier. When the time finally came to walk into the waiting arms of the sea, Catherine found Morrison's final entries, written in shaking hand, the ink smeared with what looked suspiciously like blood. He described the growing hole in his mouth, where he had removed 7 teeth over the course of a week, the constant taste of copper and salt that reminded him of the ocean's embrace. The voices had grown so loud by then that he could barely hear his own thoughts over their constant whispers. On his last night, Morrison wrote about seeing the spirits more clearly than ever before. They were no longer confined to the water. Dozens of drowned figures now stood on the lighthouse gallery itself, their wet footprints marking the stone floor in patterns that hurt his eyes to look at directly. They spoke in unison now, their voices harmonizing in a song that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate in his bones. The song told him about the ancient hunger that dwelt in the deepest trenches off the Scottish coast, a thing older than human civilization that fed on the life force of drowning victims. The lighthouse keepers weren't just committing suicide, they were being harvested, their souls adding to the creature's ever-growing power. Each death made it stronger, more capable of reaching out to influence the living world above. But Morrison had discovered something else in those final hours, something that filled his last journal entry with desperate hope. The creature needed willing victims to maintain its hold on reality. Forced deaths or accidental drownings provided sustenance, but voluntary sacrifice created a permanent link between the entity and the physical world. Every keeper who walked into the sea, by choice, became an eternal servant, helping to lure future guardians to the same fate. Catherine's hands trembled as she read Morrison's final words, written in letters so large and desperate they nearly tore through the paper. He had found a way to break the cycle, but the cost would be terrible. Instead of joining the drowned willingly, he planned to destroy the lighthouse beacon itself, severing the creature's connection to the surface world. The explosion would likely kill him, but his death would be defiant rather than submissive, potentially freeing all the trapped souls below. The journal ended abruptly there. Official records showed that William Morrison had died in an electrical fire that destroyed most of the lighthouse's upper levels. 3 days later, the beacon had been automated and repaired, but no keeper had been assigned to the station. Since then, Catherine now understood why. As she finished reading, the sun had long since set, and the lighthouse beacon began its nightly rotation. But something was different. Tonight, instead of the steady sweep of light she had observed from her hotel window in the village, the beam began to slow, then pause, lingering on specific points along the coastline, as if searching for something. Catherine heard her name whispered in the darkness between rotations, carried on a voice that sounded remarkably like William Morrison, but she knew better now. The creature below had learned to mimic the dead perfectly, using their voices and memories to lure new victims to their fate. The broken cycle had somehow been repaired, the lighthouse's power restored. Despite Morrison's sacrifice, the wooden box of teeth sat on the table beside Morrison's journal, and Catherine realized, with growing horror, that the collection had grown. Fresh extractions lay on top of the yellowed relics, still bearing traces of blood and tissue. Someone had been adding to the collection recently, someone who had been living in the lighthouse without the heritage foundations. Knowledge. Heavy footsteps echoed up the stone stairs below, accompanied by the wet slapping sound of bare feet on cold stone. Catherine grabbed Morrison's journal and ran toward the gallery door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The footsteps grew closer, and she could hear labored breathing mixed with the sound of dripping water. In the beam of the lighthouse, Catherine saw him clearly. William Morrison stood in the doorway, his skin pale and bloated from decades underwater, seaweed tangled in his hair and barnacles crusting his waterlogged clothes. His mouth gaped open in a smile that revealed the gaps where he had pulled his own teeth, and his eyes held the same peaceful contentment she had read about in his journal. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood Thomas Hartwell, Jeffrey Price, and a dozen other former keepers, all bearing the marks of their underwater existence. They moved with the slow, deliberate motion of deep-sea creatures, their limbs swaying as if still moved by invisible currents. Morrison spoke with a voice like grinding shells, explaining that his sacrifice had been incomplete. The creature below had claimed him anyway, turning his defiance into another form of servitude. The lighthouse still called to sensitive souls, still harvested the lonely and desperate who sought isolation on Scotland's remote coastlines. Catherine was to be the next keeper, he told her. She had the right kind of mind, scholarly, methodical, prone to obsession. The voices would be gentle with her at first, sharing fascinating historical details about the ships that had been lost here, the lives that had ended in these waters. Her academic nature would make her eager to document everything, to create a comprehensive record of the supernatural phenomena. But documentation would become obsession, and obsession would become compulsion. Within months, she would begin her own collection of teeth, following the same path that had claimed every guardian of Ravenshore Light for over 2 centuries. The cycle would continue, feeding the ancient hunger that waited In the crushing darkness below, the drowned keepers surrounded Catherine now, their cold hands reaching for her as the lighthouse beam continued its hypnotic rotation. In the distance, she could hear the voices of the drowned congregation calling from the waves, welcoming their newest sister to an eternity of service. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the wooden box of teeth, waiting patiently for its next addition to the eternal collection. The ancient mariners of Cornwall spoke of it in hushed whispers, a place where the sea itself hungered for souls, where ships vanished without sending even a single distress call, where the very rocks seemed to pulse with an otherworldly malevolence. Captain Oliver Whitmore had sailed these treacherous waters for 37 years. His weathered hands gripped the wheel of the merchant vessel Northern Star as mountainous waves crashed against her hull. The storm had come from nowhere, as if summoned by some dark force lurking beneath the churning depths. "Captain," shouted his first mate Jackson Hayes, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. "The compass, it's spinning wildly, and the radio, there's nothing but static." Oliver's blood ran cold. In all his years at sea, he had never encountered anything like this. The instruments were going haywire, as if some invisible hand was interfering with every piece of technology aboard the ship. Then he saw it. Through the sheets of rain and the violent spray of seawater, a light appeared in the distance. Not the warm, welcoming glow of a harbor, but something else entirely. Something that made his skin crawl with an inexplicable dread. "There," Oliver pointed through the storm. "A lighthouse. We can take shelter." But Jackson's face had gone pale as death. "Captain, that's Black Rock Island. The lighthouse there, it's been abandoned for over a century." Oliver squinted through the darkness. The light was unmistakably there, cutting through the storm like a beacon of hope. Yet something about it felt wrong. The beam didn't sweep in the typical circular pattern of a lighthouse. Instead, it pulsed rhythmically, almost like a heartbeat. "Abandoned or not," Oliver growled, "it's our only chance." The Northern Star fought against the waves as they navigated toward the mysterious light. But as they drew closer, Oliver noticed something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The light wasn't coming from the top of the lighthouse at all. It was emanating from somewhere below the structure, beneath the rocky shoreline, deep within the island itself. A sound drifted across the water then, faint at first, barely audible above the storm. But as they approached, it grew stronger, more distinct. It was a song, haunting and beautiful and utterly terrifying. "Do you hear that?" Jackson whispered, his eyes wide with horror. Oliver nodded slowly. The melody was unlike anything he had ever heard. It seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate directly within his soul. Every note called to him, promising rest, promising peace, promising an end to all his earthly troubles. The ship crashed against the jagged rocks with tremendous force, throwing both men to the deck. Water poured through the hull as the vessel began to sink rapidly. Oliver grabbed a life preserver and shouted to Jackson, but when he turned around, his first mate was gone. The icy water shocked Oliver's system as he plunged into the raging sea. The currents were impossibly strong, dragging him toward the island with supernatural force. He fought against them, but it was useless. The sea had chosen him, and the sea would not be denied. When Oliver finally dragged himself onto the rocky shore, his lungs burning and his body battered, the storm had mysteriously begun to calm. The lighthouse loomed above him like a sentinel of the damned, its ancient stone walls covered in strange markings that seemed to shift and writhe in the pale light. He climbed the treacherous path to the lighthouse, his wet clothes clinging to his shivering body. The massive wooden door stood slightly ajar, creaking softly in the wind. Oliver pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was covered in decades of dust and decay. Cobwebs hung like funeral shrouds from every surface. The spiral staircase that led to the lamp room was partially collapsed, making it impossible to reach the top. But the light was still there, still pulsing, still calling. Oliver followed the source of the illumination to a narrow staircase. he hadn't noticed before. This one led down, deep into the bowels of the island itself. With each step, the song grew stronger, more beautiful, more irresistible. The stairs ended at a cavern that stretched far beyond what his eyes could see. Phosphorescent algae covered the walls, creating an eerie blue-green glow that danced across the wet stone. And there, in the center of the cavern, was a pool of water so perfectly still it looked like black glass. The song was coming from the pool. As Oliver approached, the water began to ripple. Something was rising from the depths. Something that had been waiting for over a century. Something that had been using the lighthouse as bait, luring ships to their doom with its hypnotic melody. A figure emerged from the water. At first glance, it appeared to be a woman of extraordinary beauty. Her long hair flowed like seaweed, and her skin had a pale, luminescent quality. But her eyes were completely black, like two bottomless pits that reflected nothing but endless hunger. "Welcome, Captain," she said, her voice like honey mixed with poison. "I have been so lonely down here. Waiting, always waiting." Oliver tried to back away, but found his feet would not obey. The creature's song had wrapped around his mind like chains, holding him captive. The teeth served another purpose as well. They were anchors, physical connections, to the world of the living that had to be severed before a soul could fully cross over to the realm of the drowned. Each extracted tooth weakened the barrier between life and death, making the transition easier. When the time finally came to walk into the waiting arms of the sea, Catherine found Morrison's final entries, written in shaking hand, the ink smeared with what looked suspiciously like blood. He described the growing hole in his mouth, where he had removed 7 teeth over the course of a week, the constant taste of copper and salt that reminded him of the ocean's embrace. The voices had grown so loud by then that he could barely hear his own thoughts over their constant whispers. On his last night, Morrison wrote about seeing the spirits more clearly than ever before. They were no longer confined to the water. Dozens of drowned figures now stood on the lighthouse gallery itself, their wet footprints marking the stone floor in patterns that hurt his eyes to look at directly. They spoke in unison now, their voices harmonizing in a song that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate in his bones. The song told him about the ancient hunger that dwelt in the deepest trenches off the Scottish coast, a thing older than human civilization that fed on the life force of drowning victims. The lighthouse keepers weren't just committing suicide, they were being harvested, their souls adding to the creature's ever-growing power. Each death made it stronger, more capable of reaching out to influence the living world above. But Morrison had discovered something else in those final hours, something that filled his last journal entry with desperate hope. The creature needed willing victims to maintain its hold on reality. Forced deaths or accidental drownings provided sustenance, but voluntary sacrifice created a permanent link between the entity and the physical world. Every keeper who walked into the sea, by choice, became an eternal servant, helping to lure future guardians to the same fate. Catherine's hands trembled as she read Morrison's final words, written in letters so large and desperate they nearly tore through the paper. He had found a way to break the cycle, but the cost would be terrible. Instead of joining the drowned willingly, he planned to destroy the lighthouse beacon itself, severing the creature's connection to the surface world. The explosion would likely kill him, but his death would be defiant rather than submissive, potentially freeing all the trapped souls below. The journal ended abruptly there. Official records showed that William Morrison had died in an electrical fire that destroyed most of the lighthouse's upper levels. 3 days later, the beacon had been automated, and repaired, but no keeper had been assigned to the station. Since then, Catherine now understood why. As she finished reading, the sun had long since set, and the lighthouse beacon began its nightly rotation. But something was different. Tonight, instead of the steady sweep of light she had observed from her hotel window in the village, the beam began to slow, then pause, lingering on specific points along the coastline, as if searching for something. Catherine heard her name whispered in the darkness between rotations, carried on a voice that sounded remarkably like William Morrison, but she knew better now. The creature below had learned to mimic the dead perfectly, using their voices and memories to lure new victims to their fate. The broken cycle had somehow been repaired, the lighthouse's power restored. Despite Morrison's sacrifice, the wooden box of teeth sat on the table beside Morrison's journal, and Catherine realized, with growing horror, that the collection had grown. Fresh extractions lay on top of the yellowed relics, still bearing traces of blood and tissue. Someone had been adding to the collection recently, someone who had been living in the lighthouse without the heritage foundations. Knowledge. Heavy footsteps echoed up the stone stairs below, accompanied by the wet slapping sound of bare feet on cold stone. Catherine grabbed Morrison's journal and ran toward the gallery door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The footsteps grew closer, and she could hear labored breathing mixed with the sound of dripping water. In the beam of the lighthouse, Catherine saw him clearly. William Morrison stood in the doorway, his skin pale and bloated from decades underwater, seaweed tangled in his hair and barnacles crusting his waterlogged clothes. His mouth gaped open in a smile that revealed the gaps where he had pulled his own teeth, and his eyes held the same peaceful contentment she had read about in his journal. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood Thomas Hartwell, Jeffrey Price, and a dozen other former keepers, all bearing the marks of their underwater existence. They moved with the slow, deliberate motion of deep-sea creatures, their limbs swaying as if still moved by invisible currents. Morrison spoke with a voice like grinding shells, explaining that his sacrifice had been incomplete. The creature below had claimed him anyway, turning his defiance into another form of servitude. The lighthouse still called to sensitive souls, still harvested the lonely and desperate who sought isolation on Scotland's remote coastlines. Catherine was to be the next keeper, he told her. She had the right kind of mind, scholarly, methodical, prone to obsession. The voices would be gentle with her at first, sharing fascinating historical details about the ships that had been lost here, the lives that had ended in these waters. Her academic nature would make her eager to document everything, to create a comprehensive record of the supernatural phenomena. But documentation would become obsession, and obsession would become compulsion. Within months, she would begin her own collection of teeth, following the same path that had claimed every guardian of Ravenshore Light for over 2 centuries. The cycle would continue, feeding the ancient hunger that waited in the crushing darkness below. The drowned keepers surrounded Catherine now, their cold hands reaching for her as the lighthouse beam continued its hypnotic rotation. In the distance, she could hear the voices of the drowned congregation calling from waves, welcoming their newest sister to an eternity of service. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the wooden box of teeth, waiting patiently for its next addition to the eternal collection. The pain, Morrison wrote, was a necessary purification, a way of demonstrating his worthiness to join the underwater community that called to him. Each night, the teeth served another purpose as well. They were anchors, physical connections, to the world of the living that had to be severed before a soul could fully cross over to the realm of the drowned. Each extracted tooth weakened the barrier between life and death, making the transition easier. When the time finally came to walk into the waiting arms of the sea, Catherine found Morrison's final entries, written in a shaking hand, the ink smeared with what looked suspiciously like blood. He described the growing hole in his mouth where he had removed 7 teeth over the course of a week, the constant taste of copper and salt that reminded him of the ocean's embrace. The voices had grown so loud by then that he could barely hear his own thoughts over their constant whispers. On his last night, Morrison wrote about seeing the spirits more clearly than ever before. They were no longer confined to the water. Dozens of drowned figures now stood on the lighthouse gallery itself, their wet footprints marking the stone floor in patterns that hurt his eyes to look at directly. They spoke in unison now, their voices harmonizing in a song that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate in his bones. The song told him about the ancient hunger that dwelt in the deepest trenches off the Scottish coast, a thing older than human civilization that fed on the life force of drowning victims. The lighthouse keepers weren't just committing suicide, they were being harvested, their souls adding to the creature's ever-growing power. Each death made it stronger, more capable of reaching out to influence the living world above. But Morrison had discovered something else in those final hours, something that filled his last journal entry with desperate hope. The creature needed willing victims to maintain its hold on reality. Forced deaths or accidental drownings provided sustenance, but voluntary sacrifice created a permanent link between the entity and the physical world. Every keeper who walked into the sea, by choice, became an eternal servant, helping to lure future guardians to the same fate. Catherine's hands trembled as she read Morrison's final words, written in letters so large and desperate they nearly tore through the paper. He had found a way to break the cycle, but the cost would be terrible. Instead of joining the drowned willingly, he planned to destroy the lighthouse beacon itself, severing the creature's connection to the surface world. The explosion would likely kill him, but his death would be defiant rather than submissive, potentially freeing all the trapped souls below. The journal ended abruptly there. Official records showed that William Morrison had died in an electrical fire that destroyed most of the lighthouse's upper levels. 3 days later, the beacon had been automated and repaired, but no keeper had been assigned to the station. Since then, Catherine now understood why. As she finished reading, the sun had long since set, and the lighthouse beacon began its nightly rotation. But something was different. Tonight, instead of the steady sweep of light she had observed from her hotel window in the village, the beam began to slow, then pause, lingering on specific points along the coastline, as if searching for something. Catherine heard her name whispered in the darkness between rotations, carried on a voice that sounded remarkably like William Morrison. But she knew better now. The creature below had learned to mimic the dead perfectly, using their voices and memories to lure new victims to their fate. The broken cycle had somehow been repaired, the lighthouse's power restored. Despite Morrison's sacrifice, the wooden box of teeth sat on the table beside Morrison's journal, and Catherine realized with growing horror that the collection had grown. Fresh extractions lay on top of the yellowed relics, still bearing traces of blood and tissue. Someone had been adding to the collection recently, someone who had been living in the lighthouse without the heritage foundations. Knowledge, heavy footsteps, echoed up the stone stairs below, accompanied by the wet slapping sound of bare feet on cold stone. Catherine grabbed Morrison's journal and ran toward the gallery door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The footsteps grew closer, and she could hear labored breathing mixed with the sound of dripping water. In the beam of the lighthouse, Catherine saw him clearly. William Morrison stood in the doorway, his skin pale and bloated from decades underwater, seaweed tangled in his hair and barnacles crusting his waterlogged clothes. His mouth gaped open in a smile that revealed the gaps where he had pulled his own teeth, and his eyes held the same peaceful contentment she had read about in his journal. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood Thomas Hartwell, Jeffrey Price, and a dozen other former keepers, all bearing the marks of their underwater existence. They moved with the slow, deliberate motion of deep-sea creatures, their limbs swaying as if still moved by invisible currents. Morrison spoke with a voice like grinding shells, explaining that his sacrifice had been incomplete. The creature below had claimed him anyway, turning his defiance into another form of servitude. The lighthouse still called to sensitive souls, still harvested the lonely and desperate who sought isolation on Scotland's remote coastlines. Catherine was to be the next keeper. He told her she had the right kind of mind, scholarly, methodical, prone to obsession. The voices would be gentle with her at first, sharing fascinating historical details about the ships that had been lost here, the lives that had ended in these waters. Her academic nature would make her eager to document everything, to create a comprehensive record of the supernatural phenomena. But documentation would become obsession, and obsession would become compulsion. Within months, she would begin her own collection of teeth, following the same path that had claimed every guardian of Ravenshore Light for over 2 centuries. The cycle would continue, feeding the ancient hunger that waited in the crushing darkness below. The drowned keepers surrounded Catherine now, their cold hands reaching for her as the lighthouse beam continued its hypnotic rotation. In the distance, she could hear the voices of the drowned congregation calling from the waves, welcoming their newest sister to an eternity of service. The last thing she saw before the darkness claimed her was the wooden box of teeth, waiting patiently for its next addition to the eternal collection. Charlotte Barnes had always believed that inspiration came from solitude. As a best-selling novelist from Vancouver, she had spent years crafting psychological thrillers from the comfort of her downtown apartment. But after 3 consecutive bestsellers, the words had stopped coming. Her publisher, demanding another manuscript, had grown impatient. That's when she discovered the advertisement in an obscure literary magazine. Decommissioned Lighthouse available for long-term rental. Perfect for writers seeking isolation. Wicklow's Hollow, Nova Scotia. The photograph showed a towering white structure perched on jagged cliffs, surrounded by nothing but endless ocean and weathered rocks. It looked like the perfect place to rediscover her creative voice. The journey to Wicklow's Hollow took Charlotte through winding coastal roads that seemed to lead nowhere. The GPS signal had been intermittent for the last hour, and she relied on handwritten directions from the property manager, a gruff man named Thomas Whitmore, who had met her at the local village. "You sure about this, miss?" Thomas had asked, his weathered face creased with concern. "Lighthouse has been empty for near 20 years. Most folks don't last more than a week." Charlotte had laughed off his warning. She was used to isolation, and the thought of complete solitude excited her. The lighthouse would be her sanctuary, a place where she could finally write the novel that had been eluding her. As her rental car approached the property, Charlotte felt her breath catch in her throat. The lighthouse was even more imposing in person, its white walls stark against the gray October sky. The building rose nearly 60 feet into the air, its beacon chamber dark and empty. A small keeper's cottage sat at its base, connected by a covered walkway. Thomas helped her unload her belongings, which consisted mainly of boxes of research materials, her laptop, and enough food supplies to last several weeks. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door of the cottage. "Generator's out back if the power goes. Water comes from a well, so it might taste a bit strange at first. And miss," he hesitated, his pale blue eyes troubled, "if you start having dreams about the water, maybe it's time to consider leaving." Before Charlotte could ask what he meant, Thomas was gone, his truck disappearing down the winding road that connected the lighthouse to civilization. Charlotte spent her first day settling into the cottage. The interior was sparse but functional, with a small kitchen, a living area dominated by a stone fireplace, and a bedroom that offered a spectacular view of the Atlantic Ocean. The lighthouse itself was accessible through the covered walkway, and Charlotte was delighted to discover that the lamp room at the top provided a perfect writing space with panoramic ocean views. As evening approached, she prepared a simple dinner and opened a bottle of wine she had brought from the city. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below. For the first time in months, Charlotte felt her creative energy returning. She wrote until nearly midnight, filling several pages with notes for her new novel. The story was beginning to take shape, a psychological thriller about a woman who becomes obsessed with the mysterious history of her isolated home. As she worked, Charlotte found herself drawing inspiration from her surroundings, incorporating the lighthouse's haunting atmosphere into her narrative. Exhausted from the day's activities and the long journey, Charlotte retired to the bedroom around 1 in the morning. The cottage felt secure and peaceful, and she fell asleep quickly to the sound of distant waves. But her dreams were anything but peaceful. In her sleep, Charlotte found herself standing on a rocky shoreline she didn't recognize. The water was unusually calm, almost mirror-like, reflecting a full moon that seemed impossibly bright. She felt drawn to the water's edge, her bare feet finding purchase on the slippery rocks. As she waded deeper into the ocean, Charlotte realized with growing horror that she couldn't stop moving forward. The water rose to her waist, then her chest, then her shoulders. She tried to turn back, but her body wouldn't respond to her commands. The moonlight began to fade, and the water turned black as ink. She was drowning. Charlotte woke with a gasp, her heart pounding so violently she could hear it in her ears. Pale morning light filtered through the bedroom curtains, and she sat up in bed, trying to shake off the vivid nightmare. But as she threw back the covers, her blood turned to ice. There, tangled in the sheets near her feet, were several strands of dark green seaweed. The plant matter was damp and smelled strongly of brine and decay. Charlotte's hands trembled as she picked up the seaweed, trying to rationalize its presence. Perhaps it had been stuck to her shoes when she arrived, or maybe Thomas had tracked it in while helping with her luggage. But as she stood to dispose of the mysterious seaweed, Charlotte noticed something else that made her stomach drop. A small puddle of seawater had formed beneath the bedroom door. The water was crystal clear and smelled distinctly of the ocean, but Charlotte knew for certain that the lighthouse sat at least 40 feet above the highest tide mark. Over the next 3 nights, Charlotte's dreams became increasingly disturbing. Each night, she found herself drawn to different bodies of water, sometimes a lake surrounded by dense forest, other times a river that flowed through an unfamiliar city. But the ending was always the same. The water would rise around her, and she would wake up gasping for air, feeling as though her lungs were filled with seawater. And every morning, without exception, she would find evidence of her nocturnal visitations. Seaweed appeared in her bed in increasing quantities, sometimes wrapped around her wrists and ankles like restraints. The puddles of water beneath her door grew larger, forming irregular patterns that reminded Charlotte of something she couldn't quite identify. On the fourth morning, she decided to explore the lighthouse more thoroughly, hoping to find a logical explanation for the mysterious water. The circular staircase that wound up the interior of the tower was narrow and steep, with small windows at regular intervals that provided glimpses of the surrounding coastline. Charlotte climbed slowly, examining each level carefully. The lighthouse had been converted for habitation at some point in its history, with small rooms built into the curved walls. Most were empty, containing only dust and the occasional piece of abandoned furniture. But on the third level, Charlotte discovered something that made her pause. A room that had apparently served as a study contained a desk covered with old newspapers, books, and what appeared to be research materials. As Charlotte examined the papers more closely, she realized they were all related to drowning incidents along the Nova Scotia coast. The newspapers dated back several decades, their headlines describing tragic accidents and mysterious disappearances. "Local woman vanishes during evening swim," read one headline from 1987. "Body never recovered from Wicklow Bay," announced another from 1992. There were dozens of similar articles, all documenting cases of people who had drowned in the waters surrounding the lighthouse. At the bottom of the pile, Charlotte found a leather journal filled with handwritten notes. The writing was feminine and precise, belonging to someone who had clearly been researching the drowning incident systematically. As Charlotte read, she learned that the journal belonged to Dr. Evelyn Blackwood, a marine biologist from Edinburgh who had rented the lighthouse in 1998. Dr. Blackwood's entries began optimistically, describing her intention to study unusual tidal patterns around Wicklow's Hollow. But as the weeks progressed, her tone became increasingly frantic and confused. She wrote about strange dreams, mysterious water in her bedroom, and an overwhelming compulsion to enter the ocean at night. The final entry, dated October 31st, 1998, was barely legible. "The water calls to me constantly now. I understand what happened to the others. The lighthouse, it's not just built on the rocks. There's something beneath it, something that feeds on. I can't fight it much longer. If someone finds this journal, please warn them. Don't stay here. The dreams are just the beginning." That evening, Charlotte tried to convince herself that Dr. Blackwood's journal was the product of an unstable mind. Perhaps the isolation had affected her judgment, or maybe she had suffered from some form of mental illness that made her susceptible to paranoid delusions. But as darkness fell over Wicklow's Hollow, Charlotte found it increasingly difficult to dismiss the warnings. She prepared for bed with growing anxiety, checking the locks on both the cottage door and the connecting walkway to the lighthouse. She even placed towels along the base of the bedroom door, hoping to prevent any mysterious water from seeping in during the night. But her precautions proved useless. The dream that night was more vivid and terrifying than any she had experienced before. Charlotte found herself not on a shoreline, but deep underwater, surrounded by the wreckage of what appeared to be ships and boats from different eras. The water around her was impossibly clear, allowing her to see the skeletal remains of dozens of people trapped among the debris. As she tried to swim toward the surface, Charlotte realized that tentacles, thick and dark as ship's rope, were wrapped around her ankles, pulling her deeper into the underwater graveyard. She could see faces in the water around her, the pale and bloated features of people who had drowned in these waters over the decades. And then, rising from the depths below her, Charlotte saw something that defied comprehension. A massive form, ancient and alien, with countless tentacles and eyes that glowed with malevolent intelligence. The creature's presence filled her mind with whispers and languages she didn't recognize, but somehow understood. "Come to us," the voices hissed. "Join the others. Feed the depths with your essence." Charlotte woke screaming, her lungs burning as if they were filled with seawater. But this time, the evidence of her supernatural experience was impossible to ignore. Her entire bed was soaked with salt water, and seaweed covered not just the sheets, but the entire floor of the bedroom. The smell of decay and brine was overwhelming. As she stumbled toward the door, Charlotte's bare feet slipped on the wet floor. Looking down, she saw that the water wasn't just pooling beneath the door. It was actively flowing into the room from somewhere within the lighthouse itself. Following the trail of water, Charlotte made her way through the connecting walkway and into the base of the lighthouse. The stone floor was covered with at least 2 inches of seawater, and she could hear the sound of more water flowing from somewhere above. Climbing the spiral staircase, Charlotte tracked the source of the water to the very top of the lighthouse, where the beacon chamber housed a massive lens that had once warned ships away from the treacherous coast. But now, instead of light, the chamber was filled with water that seemed to glow with an eerie phosphorescence. As Charlotte approached the lens, she could see something moving within the water, shapes that might have been fish or tentacles, or the limbs of something far more sinister. And then, reflected in the curved surface of the lens, she saw her own face, but changed. Her skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, and her eyes had become completely black. Behind her reflection, Charlotte could see the faces of others, Dr. Blackwood among them, all of them reaching toward her with expressions of desperate longing. They were trapped within the lighthouse somehow, their souls bound to feed whatever ancient entity dwelt in the depths below Wicklow's Hollow. "You understand now," Dr. Blackwood's voice whispered from within the lens. "The lighthouse was never meant to warn ships away from the rocks. It was built to lure them here, to feed the thing that sleeps beneath the waves." Charlotte tried to back away from the lens, but found that her feet wouldn't move. The water around her ankles had begun to freeze, or rather, to thicken into something that held her in place like concrete. She could feel her strength leaving her body, draining away into the supernatural water that surrounded her. "Every generation, it chooses someone new," Dr. Blackwood continued, her voice growing stronger as Charlotte grew weaker. "Someone creative, someone whose imagination can help it grow stronger. Your stories, your dreams, they feed it as much as your life force." Charlotte realized with dawning horror that her novel, the psychological thriller she had been writing about the lighthouse, wasn't her own creation. The ideas had been planted in her mind by the entity below, a way to strengthen the connection between them. As the water continued to rise around her, Charlotte made one last desperate attempt to escape. Using all her remaining strength, she broke free from the thickened water and ran toward the staircase. But as she reached the top step, she could hear the sound of rushing water from below. The entire lighthouse was flooding. Charlotte ran down the stairs as fast as she dared, the water level rising behind her like a pursuing wave. By the time she reached the bottom, the water was already waist-deep and climbing rapidly. The cottage door was blocked by the flood, leaving her trapped within the lighthouse itself. As the water reached her chest, Charlotte felt something brush against her legs. Looking down, she saw tentacles, dozens of them, emerging from the depths of the supernatural flood. They wrapped around her limbs with gentle but inexorable pressure, pulling her down into the dark water. Her last coherent thought, as the water closed over her head, was a realization about Thomas's warning. He hadn't been trying to scare her away from the lighthouse. He had been trying to save her life. But it was too late for warnings now. 3 weeks later, Thomas Whitmore drove out to Wicklow's Hollow to check on his tenant. He found Charlotte's rental car still parked beside the lighthouse, her belongings still scattered throughout the cottage. But of Charlotte herself, there was no sign. The official report listed her as a missing person, presumably drowned in a tragic accident. The lighthouse was once again marked as available for rent, and within a month, Thomas received a call from a playwright in Melbourne who was interested in a quiet place to work on her next production. As he prepared the cottage for its new occupant, Thomas noticed that someone had left research materials in the lighthouse study. Newspapers about drowning incidents, scientific journals, and a leather notebook filled with increasingly frantic handwriting. He gathered all the papers into a box and stored them in the basement of the cottage, where future tenants would be unlikely to find them. After all, there was no point in frightening people unnecessarily. The lighthouse stood empty for exactly 2 weeks before Vivian Mackenzie arrived from Australia, her car loaded with theatrical scripts and creative supplies. She was excited about the isolation, the inspiration she was sure to find in such a haunting and atmospheric location. On her first night at Wicklow's Hollow, Vivian dreamed of drowning, and when she woke the next morning, she found seaweed in her bed. The lighthouse stood like a bone finger against the gray main sky, its white tower piercing through the perpetual fog that wrapped around Ravens Point Island like a burial shroud. Thomas Bradley had accepted the lighthouse keeper position 3 months ago, drawn by the promise of solitude and decent pay. What the Coast Guard recruiter hadn't mentioned was the bell, the incessant, haunting bell that rang every night from sunset to dawn. Dong, dong, dong. The sound echoed across the rocky shores, a deep, metallic tolling that seemed to come from the very soul of the lighthouse itself. Thomas had searched every inch of the tower during his first week, looking for the source of that maddening sound. But there was no bell, not anymore. According to the maintenance logs, the original fog bell had been removed 15 years ago, replaced by an automated horn system. Yet every night, without fail, the ghostly tolling began. Dong, dong, dong. Thomas stood in his small keeper's quarters, staring out at the churning Atlantic waters. The fog was rolling in again, thick and suffocating, carrying with it the familiar dread that settled in his chest every evening. He tried calling the Coast Guard, tried explaining about the bell, but they'd only laughed. Phantom sounds are common in old lighthouses, they'd said. The wind, the waves, your mind playing tricks. But this was no trick of the mind. This was real as the cold sweat that broke across his forehead every time that bell began its nightly chorus of the damned. Dong, dong, dong. Tonight felt different, though. Tonight, the fog seemed thicker, more alive somehow. Thomas could see shapes moving within it, shadows that shouldn't exist, figures that walked the rocky shoreline below. He grabbed his flashlight and heavy coat. After 3 months of sleepless nights, after 3 months of that infernal bell driving him to the edge of madness, he was going to find answers. The basement of the lighthouse, the one section he'd never properly explored, the one with the locked door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." The iron key felt ice cold in his palm as he descended the spiral staircase. Each step echoed through the hollow tower, mixing with the ever-present tolling that seemed to grow louder, more insistent as he moved deeper into the lighthouse's bowels. Dong, dong, dong. The basement door opened with the S-series of rusted hinges. Thomas's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing stone walls slick with moisture and something else, something dark and viscous that might have been blood, or might have been something far worse. The beam landed on a wooden sign, weathered and barely legible. Lighthouse Keeper's Memorial Crypt, EST 1847. Thomas's blood turned to icy in his veins. This wasn't mentioned in any of the lighthouse documentation. No one had told him about a crypt beneath his feet, about the dead who lay buried in the foundation of his temporary home. Dong, dong, dong. The bell tolled louder now, so loud that the stone walls seemed to vibrate with each strike. Thomas moved deeper into the crypt, his flashlight revealing row after row of stone markers, names carved into granite, dates spanning over a century. Jeremiah Collins, Keeper 1847 to 1851. Never left his post. Wilhelm Morrison, Keeper 1851 to 1859. Claimed by the fog. Alessandro Rossetti, Keeper 1859 to 1863. Vanished without trace. And more dozens more. Each stone told the same story. Keepers who had come to Ravens Point and never left. Thomas's hand shook as he read the inscriptions, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. The most recent grave made his heart stop completely. David Cameron, Keeper 2010 to 2024, joined the Eternal Watch. David Cameron, the keeper who had supposedly retired just 3 months ago, whose position Thomas had taken. The keeper who was meant to be living peacefully on the mainland was buried right here beneath Thomas's feet. Dong, dong, dong. The bell grew deafening, and with it came the voices. Whispers at first, then growing stronger, clearer. The voices of dead keepers, all speaking in unison, all saying the same words. The watch never ends. The watch never ends. The watch never ends. Thomas stumbled backward, his flashlight beam dancing wildly across the crypt walls. In the shadows between the graves, he could see them now. Figures in lighthouse keeper uniforms, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes black as the fog-shrouded sea. Jeremiah Collins stepped forward, his 19th century uniform rotting off his skeletal frame. When he spoke, his voice was like wind through broken glass. "Welcome, Thomas Bradley. We've been waiting for you." "This isn't real," Thomas whispered, backing toward the door. "This can't be real." Wilhelm Morrison emerged from behind a stone pillar, water dripping from his decomposed flesh. "Real," he laughed, a sound like drowning. "What's real is the duty, the sacred duty of the keeper. The light must never die. The watch must never end." Dong, dong, dong. Alessandro Rossetti joined the circle, his uniform bearing the stains of a century underground. "You thought you could leave, just like the others thought they could leave. But Raven's Point doesn't let go, not of its keepers." Thomas's back hit the door, his trembling fingers fumbling for the handle. But it wouldn't turn, wouldn't budge. The door was sealed, locked from the outside by some impossible force. David Cameron, the most recent addition to this congregation of the dead, stepped into the light. His face was still mostly intact, still recognizable from the photograph Thomas had seen in the Coast Guard files. But his eyes were empty, hollow, filled with the darkness of 15 years underground. "They told you I retired, didn't they?" David's voice was soft, conversational, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "That I'd gone to live with my sister in Portland? That I was happy to leave this place behind?" Thomas couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The air in the crypt was thick, choking, filled with the smell of decay and salt water. "The truth is, Thomas, none of us ever leave. We become part of the lighthouse, part of its eternal purpose. The bell you hear every night, it's not a fog signal, it's a funeral bell. It tolls for every keeper who tried to abandon his post, who thought he could escape his duty." Dong, dong, dong. The sound was inside Thomas's head now, pounding against his skull like a sledgehammer. The dead keepers began to move closer, their rotting hands reaching out, their mouths opening to reveal teeth stained black with grave dirt. "Your 3 months are up, Thomas," Jeremiah whispered. "The trial period is over. Time to join the permanent staff." Thomas found his voice, a strangled scream that echoed through the crypt. "No, I won't. I'll leave. I'll quit. I'll swim to the mainland if I have to." The laughter that erupted from the dead keepers was like the sound of coffin nails being driven into wood. Wilhelm shook his head, water streaming from his eye sockets. "Look around you, Thomas. Count the graves. Every man buried here said the same thing, made the same desperate promises. But the lighthouse claims its own." Alessandro stepped forward, his skeletal fingers trailing ice-cold air. "The fog you see every night, it's not natural weather. It's the breath of the dead, the keepers who came before. We call to the living, draw them here, make them believe they have a choice." Dong, dong, dong. The bell was overwhelming now, so loud that Thomas could feel his eardrums beginning to bleed. Through his agony, he heard David Cameron's voice closer now, right beside his ear. "The Coast Guard will list you as missing, just like they did with me. They'll say you abandoned your post, went mad from the isolation. In a few months, they'll send a new keeper. The cycle will continue, as it has for over a century." Thomas felt cold hands grabbing his arms, his shoulders, pulling him deeper into the crypt. The flashlight fell from his numb fingers, its beams spinning wildly before going out completely. In the absolute darkness, he could hear the sound of stone scraping against stone, the lid of a coffin being opened. "Please," he whimpered, his voice barely audible over the deafening bell. "Please, I have a family, wife, children." Jeremiah Collins' voice was the last thing he heard clearly. "We all had families, Thomas. We all had lives we thought we'd return to. But the lighthouse is jealous. It doesn't share its keepers with the world of the living." Dong, dong, dong. The sound began to fade, not because it was stopping, but because Thomas was sinking into something deeper than sound, deeper than death itself. He felt earth and stone closing over him, felt his lungs filling with the thick, choking fog that was the breath of the damned. As consciousness slipped away, Thomas understood the terrible truth. The lighthouse keepers weren't prisoners, they were guardians. They kept the light burning not for the ships passing in the night, but to contain something far worse, something that had been trapped beneath Ravens Point Island for over a century. The bell wasn't calling ships to safety. It was keeping something else at bay. And now, Thomas Bradley would join that eternal watch, would become another voice in the chorus of the dead, would help ring the bell that never stops forever and ever, until the end of time itself. Dong, dong, dong. 3 months later, Matthew Harrison answered a Coast Guard advertisement for a lighthouse keeper position on a small island off the Maine coast. The pay was good, the isolation appealing after his messy divorce. What the recruiter didn't mention was the bell, the incessant, haunting bell that would begin ringing the moment the fog rolled in. And in the basement of the lighthouse, in a crypt that didn't appear on any official blueprints, a new grave marker was being carved by dead hands. Thomas Bradley, Keeper 2024 to 2024, answered the call. The watch never ends, the bell never stops, and Ravens Point Island is always looking for new keepers to join its permanent staff. Those who seek solitude by the sea should remember that some silences are more dangerous than any storm, and some jobs come with a contract that extends far beyond the grave. Dong, dong, dong. The bell tolls on, through fog and fair weather, through summer heat and winter storms, calling to the living, claiming the unwary, and adding new voices to its eternal symphony of the damned. And somewhere in the darkness, Matthew Harrison is beginning to hear the first, faint tolling of his own funeral bell. The lighthouse stood like a bone-white finger against the endless Arctic darkness. For 47 years, Beacon Point had guided ships through the treacherous waters of Hudson Bay. And for 47 years, only 2 keepers had ever been stationed there at a time. The isolation was complete, the nearest settlement 300 miles south. David Thompson had been keeper of Beacon Point for 12 years. His partner, James Morrison, had arrived 6 months ago to replace old Henrik, who had retired. They were good men, reliable men, chosen specifically for their ability to handle the crushing loneliness that came with the job. But loneliness, David was beginning to realize, was not their problem. The first incident happened on a Tuesday in November, when the Arctic night had settled in for its long winter rain. David was climbing the spiral stairs to check the beacon when he heard James talking to someone in the lamp room above. The voice was clear, conversational, discussing weather patterns and ship movements. "Who are you talking to?" David asked when he reached the top. James looked confused. "What do you mean?" "I heard voices. You and someone else." James shook his head slowly. "I've been up here alone for the past hour, David. Haven't said a word." David felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic wind. He had heard 2 distinct voices clearly, but the lamp room was empty except for James and the massive beacon that swept its light across the dark waters. 3 days later, James came down from his night watch looking pale and shaken. "There's someone up there," he said, his breath forming clouds in the cold morning air. "What?" "In the lamp room. I was adjusting the beacon when I heard footsteps behind me. Heavy boots on a metal grating. When I turned around, I saw—" James paused, running a hand through his graying hair. "I saw a shadow, a person-shaped shadow moving along the far wall, but there was no one there to cast it." David felt his stomach tighten. "James, you know there's only the 2 of us here. The supply boat isn't due for another month." "I know what I saw." That afternoon, David climbed to the lamp room during James's rest period. The circular room was exactly as it should be, the beacon slowly rotating, casting its beam across the ice-covered waters. He walked the perimeter, checking every corner, every shadow. Nothing. But as he prepared to leave, he heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone clearing their throat, a soft, polite sound that seemed to come from directly behind him. David spun around, his heart hammering against his ribs. The room was empty. Over the next week, the incidents multiplied. David would hear James having full conversations with someone when he was supposed to be alone on watch. James would insist he heard a 3rd person climbing the stairs when only David should be moving through the lighthouse. They both began finding things moved, rearranged in ways that neither of them remembered doing. Most disturbing were the sounds at night. Footsteps in the lamp room above when both men were in their quarters below. The scraping of chair legs being moved. Once clearly, the sound of someone humming an old sea shanty that neither David nor James recognized. "We need to check the logs," David said one morning over coffee. "Maybe we're both just going stir-crazy." They pulled out the official keeper's log, the food inventory, and the duty roster. Everything was perfectly normal. 2 men, signing in and out for their shifts. Food consumed for 2 people, no more, no less. The records showed nothing unusual, nothing that would indicate a third person living in the lighthouse. But the presence continued to make itself known. James installed a small security camera in the lamp room, an old unit they used for monitoring ice formations. For 3 days, nothing appeared on the footage except the 2 of them going about their duties. Then, on the 4th day, David sat down to review the previous night's recording. James had been on the midnight to 6 watch, and David fast-forwarded through the mostly empty hours. James appeared periodically, checking the beacon, making notes in his log. At 3:17 a.m., David's blood turned to ice water. There, on the grainy black and white monitor, was a third figure. Tall, wearing what appeared to be an old-fashioned keeper's uniform. The man stood near the beacon, while James worked at the control panel just 10 feet away. The figure was perfectly clear on camera, solid and real. He appeared to be watching James work, occasionally nodding as if in approval. James showed no sign of seeing him. David's hands shook as he called James over. Together, they watched the impossible footage. The third man moved around the lamp room, sometimes standing close enough to James to touch him, sometimes walking the perimeter as if on patrol. At one point, he appeared to point out toward the water, as if directing James's attention to something in the distance. "I don't understand," James whispered. "I never saw him. I never saw anyone." They continued watching, mesmerized and terrified. The figure appeared intermittently throughout the night, always when James was present, always behaving as if he were actively participating in the watch duties. Near dawn, just as James was preparing to end his shift, the figure walked directly to the camera and looked straight into it. The face was weathered, middle-aged, with kind eyes and a graying beard. He wore the distinctive cap of a lighthouse keeper, and around his neck hung a whistle on a chain, the type used to signal ships in the days before radio. Then he smiled, raised his hand in a small wave, and faded away like morning mist. David and James sat in stunned silence as the recording ended. "We need to research this place," David finally said. "Find out who worked here before us." The lighthouse station had internet access via satellite, and David spent the afternoon digging through historical records. What he found made his skin crawl with recognition. William Connor, keeper of Beacon Point from 1978 to 1994, died at age 52 from a heart attack while on duty. The photograph in the Maritime Archives showed the same weathered face, the same kind eyes, the same graying beard they had seen on the security footage. But it was the date of William's death that made David's hands tremble as he printed the page. November 15th, 1994. 29 years ago, almost to the day when they had first heard the third voice in the lamp room. As evening fell and James prepared for the night watch, David made a decision that went against every rational thought in his mind. "I'm coming up with you tonight," he said. "David, you need your sleep." "No, I need to understand what's happening here." They climbed the stairs together as full darkness settled over the Arctic waters. The lamp room felt different somehow, charged with an expectation that made the air seem thick and heavy. David set up a chair where he could watch both James and the area where the figure had appeared on camera. For the first hour, nothing happened. James went about his duties methodically, checking instruments, scanning the horizon, making his log entries. David began to feel foolish, wondering if exhaustion and isolation had finally driven them both toward madness. Then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., the temperature in the lamp room dropped by 10 degrees. David saw him first, materializing slowly near the beacon, like a photograph developing in chemical solution. William Connor, wearing his keeper's uniform, taking up his eternal watch. The figure moved with purpose and familiarity, checking instruments that David couldn't see, noting readings on charts that existed only in some other reality. James continued his work, completely unaware of the third presence moving around him. David watched, frozen with terror and fascination, as William approached James and appeared to speak to him. James paused in his work, tilted his head as if listening, then nodded and moved to check a gauge that he had already checked 20 minutes earlier. "James," David whispered, "can you hear me?" "Of course I can hear you," James replied, not turning from his instruments. "Who are you talking to?" James turned then, confusion clear on his face. "I'm not talking to anyone. I'm working." But William Connor was standing right beside him, one translucent hand resting on James's shoulder in a gesture of guidance and companionship. Throughout the night, David watched the impossible partnership. William would point to instruments, and James would check them without understanding why. William would gesture toward the water, and James would adjust the beacon's sweep to cover areas he hadn't planned to illuminate. When James grew tired, William appeared to offer encouragement, and James would straighten up, renewed in his vigilance. The third watcher was not malevolent. He was not trying to frighten or harm them. William Connor had simply never stopped working, never stopped caring for the lighthouse and the ships that depended on its beacon. Death had not released him from his duties. It had only made him invisible to the living. As dawn approached and James prepared to end his shift, William walked once again to where David sat. The ghost keeper looked directly at him with those kind, withered eyes, and David understood with perfect clarity that William had wanted to be seen, wanted to be acknowledged. David stood slowly and faced the specter of the man who had tended this lighthouse for 16 years. "Thank you," David said quietly, "for watching over us, for helping us." William Connor smiled, that same gentle smile they had captured on camera. He nodded once, a gesture of recognition and acceptance. Then he raised his hand in a final salute and faded away with the coming light. James turned at the sound of David's voice. "Thank you for what?" David looked at his partner, then at the space where William had stood, for keeping the light burning. From that night forward, the incidents continued, but they no longer frightened David and James. They had learned to accept their invisible colleague, the third watcher who helped guide them through the long Arctic nights. The security camera continued to record William's presence, a testament to dedication that transcended death itself. And in the official keeper's log, David began adding a third line each day, acknowledging the man who had never truly left his post. Day Watch D. Thompson, Night Watch J. Morrison, Eternal Watch W. Connor. Because some duties, David now understood, are too important to abandon, even in death. The beacon at Beacon Point continued to shine, tended by 3 keepers instead of 2, guiding ships safely through the treacherous waters of Hudson Bay. And on the clearest nights, when the aurora borealis danced across the Arctic sky, ships passing in the distance would sometimes report seeing 3 figures silhouetted in the lamp room of the lighthouse. 3 watchers, standing vigil together, ensuring that no vessel would ever lose its way in the darkness. The light burned on, as it always had, as it always would, under the care of men who understood that some responsibilities transcend the boundaries between life and death. The ancient lighthouse stood like a bone-white sentinel against the storm-lashed coast of Cornwall, its weathered stones holding secrets that the Atlantic winds had whispered for over a century. Dr. James Morrison, a maritime historian from Oxford, had driven 3 hours through increasingly wild countryside to reach this forgotten outpost, drawn by a commission that promised both substantial payment and the chance to restore something truly magnificent. The lighthouse keeper's cottage sat adjacent to the tower, its windows dark and unwelcoming in the gathering dusk. James pulled his rental car up the gravel path, noting how the sound of crushing stones seemed to echo strangely in the salty air. The estate agent, Mrs. Whitmore, had warned him about the isolation, about the way the sea could make a man feel utterly alone, but James had spent years in dusty archives and crumbling libraries. Solitude was an old friend. As he stepped from the car, The first thing that struck him was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of the countryside, but something deeper, more profound. Even the waves seemed muted, as if the very air around the lighthouse absorbed sound differently. The wind carried a strange, almost metallic taste, and James found himself unconsciously holding his breath. The heavy wooden door of the cottage groaned open at his touch, revealing an interior that time had forgotten. Dust motes danced in the fading light, streaming through salt-stained windows, and every surface bore the patina of decades. But it was the photographs that immediately caught his attention. They were everywhere, covering the walls in neat rows, stacked on tables, pinned to wooden beams. Hundreds of black and white photographs spanning what appeared to be nearly a century. James moved closer, his academic mind immediately cataloging what he saw. The earliest appeared to be from the 1920s, judging by the clothing and photographic techniques. They showed various scenes around the lighthouse: storms, calm seas, visiting officials, maintenance work. But there was something else, something that made James pause and examine the images more carefully. In photograph after photograph, decade after decade, there was a man, always the same man. James pulled out his magnifying glass, the one he used for examining ancient manuscripts, and studied the images with growing bewilderment. The man appeared to be in his 30s, with sharp features and piercing dark eyes. In the 1920s photos, he stood among a group of lighthouse keepers. In the 1940s images, he was visible through the lighthouse window during a storm. The 1960s showed him walking along the rocky shore. The 1980s captured him in the cottage garden. The same face, the same build, the same clothes even, unchanged by time. James felt his heart beginning to race as he examined image after image. This was impossible. The man should have aged, should have died decades ago. Yet there he was in every era, looking exactly the same. In some photos, he was barely visible, a shadow at a window or a figure on the horizon. In others, he stood prominently in the foreground, staring directly at the camera with those unsettling eyes. The most recent photographs, dated just 5 years ago, showed the man standing at the lighthouse window, looking out to sea. James held one of these images up to the light and felt a chill run down his spine. The man was looking directly at the camera, and there was something in his expression, something that seemed to acknowledge the viewer across time. As darkness fell, James lit the old oil lamps he had found in the cottage. The electricity had been disconnected years ago, and the dancing flames cast strange shadows on the walls, making the photographs seem to move and shift. He had arranged his restoration equipment on a large oak table and was preparing to begin cataloging the lighthouse's historical artifacts when he heard it. A sound from above. Footsteps in the lighthouse tower. James froze, listening intently. The steps were slow, deliberate, moving up the circular staircase that led to the lamp room. But that was impossible. He was alone here. The estate agent had given him the only key. The lighthouse had been abandoned for over a decade. The footsteps stopped. James waited in the flickering lamplight, straining to hear any other sound. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. Then, from somewhere high above, came the sound of the lighthouse mechanism turning. The great lens began to rotate, casting its beam out across the dark ocean. But the lighthouse had been decommissioned. The electrical systems were disconnected. There was no way the light could be functioning. Yet there it was, sweeping across the waves in its eternal rhythm. James grabbed one of the oil lamps and made his way to the tower door. It stood slightly ajar, though he was certain he had checked earlier and found it locked. The circular staircase beyond disappeared into darkness above, the stone steps worn smooth by generations of lighthouse keepers. He began to climb. Each step echoed strangely, as if the sound was traveling further than it should, bouncing off surfaces that couldn't be there. The walls were covered with more photographs, dozens of them, all showing the same mysterious man. As James climbed higher, the images seemed to chronicle the man's presence at the lighthouse across the decades. There he was, always watching, always present, always unchanged. Halfway up the tower, James paused. Something had changed in the photographs. The man was no longer looking at the camera or gazing out to sea. In every image on this level, he was looking up. Following the direction of the man's gaze, James continued climbing. The lamp room at the top of the lighthouse was smaller than he had expected, dominated by the massive Fresnel lens that somehow continued to rotate and cast its beam into the night. The mechanism should have been silent, but it hummed with an energy that James could feel in his bones. The windows offered a panoramic view of the coast, and in the rotating light, he could see for miles in every direction. But it was what he saw in the window that made him stumble backward. The man from the photographs was standing outside, on the narrow walkway that circled the lamp room. He was looking directly at James, and his lips were moving as if he was speaking, though no sound penetrated the glass. James approached the window cautiously. The man appeared solid, real, but that was impossible. They were over 100 feet above the rocky shore, and there was no way anyone could have climbed up the outside of the lighthouse. As he drew closer, James realized he could make out what the man was saying. The words seemed to form directly in his mind rather than reaching his ears. "You should not have come here." James pressed his face against the glass, trying to understand what he was seeing. The man raised his hand and pointed downward, toward the base of the lighthouse. James followed the gesture and saw, far below, a figure standing among the rocks at the water's edge. It was himself. James stumbled backward, his heart pounding. That was impossible. He was here, in the lamp room, not down on the shore. But as he looked again, he could clearly see his own face looking up at the lighthouse, his own clothes, his own posture. The man outside the window smiled, and James noticed that his teeth were the color of old bone, stained by decades of salt air. When he spoke again, his words seemed to come from all around. Time moves differently here. Past and present, they flow together like the tides. James spun around, searching for another explanation, any rational answer to what he was experiencing. As he turned, he caught sight of himself reflected in the lens of the lighthouse beam. But it wasn't just his reflection he saw. Standing behind him, clear as day in the polished glass, was the man from the photographs. James whirled around, but the lamp room was empty except for himself. Yet when he looked back at the lens, the man was still there, closer now, reaching out as if to place his hand on James's shoulder. "Every lighthouse needs a keeper," the voice whispered, and now James could feel breath on his neck, cold as the ocean spray. He ran down the spiral staircase, stumbling and nearly falling, the oil lamp swinging wildly in his grip. The photographs on the walls seemed to blur as he passed, the man in the moving, turning to watch his descent. Behind him, he could hear footsteps matching his own, always just a few steps behind, never gaining, never falling back. James burst into the cottage and slammed the tower door behind him, his chest heaving. But as he turned to face the room, he saw that all the photographs had changed. Where before they had shown the mysterious man across different decades, now they showed James himself, standing at the lighthouse window, walking along the shore, working in the cottage, all dated from different years, different decades. Some showed him as he was now, others as he might look in 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. In the most recent photograph, dated 50 years in the future, an old man who was unmistakably James stood at the lighthouse window, staring out with the same piercing gaze he had seen in the mysterious man's eyes. As James stared at the images in horror, he became aware of movement in his peripheral vision. The windows of the cottage were reflecting the interior, and in those reflections, he could see himself standing exactly where he was. But he could also see the man from the photographs, standing directly behind him. James spun around once more, but there was no one there. When he looked back at the window, both figures were gone. The reflection showed only empty cottage, dust, and shadow. That's when he noticed the writing on the window glass. Scratched into the surface as if by fingernails, words appeared as his breath fogged the glass. The lighthouse must not go dark. James grabbed his car keys and ran for the door. But as his hand touched the handle, he heard his own voice speaking from somewhere behind him. "You cannot leave. Every lighthouse needs a keeper." He turned slowly, knowing what he would see but hoping desperately that he was wrong. There, standing in the center of the cottage, was himself. But this other James had the same timeless quality he had seen in the mysterious man, the same otherworldly presence. "You came here to restore the lighthouse," his double said, and its voice carried the sound of waves breaking on stone. "But the lighthouse was never broken. It has been waiting for its next keeper." James looked at his hands and saw that they were becoming translucent, like fog. The other James solidified as he himself began to fade. "Every keeper thinks he is the first," his double continued. "But we are all here, all of us who came to restore what was never broken. The man you saw in the photographs, he came in 1923. Before him, there was another and another. We are all here, James. We have always been here." As James felt himself dissolving into mist and memory, he understood with crystal clarity that he would spend the rest of eternity as a guardian of this place, watching over the lighthouse that must never go dark, appearing in photographs that future keepers would find, always unchanged, always watching, always waiting for the next scholar or historian who would answer the call to restore something that was never broken. The lighthouse beam swept across the waves, as it had for over a century, as it would for centuries to come. And in the lamp room, a figure stood at the window, staring out at the endless sea, waiting for the next visitor who would be drawn by the promise of restoration and the lure of seaborne secrets. For the lighthouse must never go dark, and every lighthouse needs a keeper. The old lighthouse keeper's journal entry from 1983 was discovered 40 years later, its pages yellowed and brittle. The final words, written in a shaking hand, read, "The light, it wasn't supposed to turn on. We disconnected everything. God help us all." Detective James Morrison had seen many crime scenes in his 20-year career with the Massachusetts State Police, but nothing quite like this. The abandoned lighthouse stood like a broken finger against the gray October sky, its white paint peeling away in long, diseased strips. The ocean crashed against the rocky shore below, sending spray high into the air where it mixed with the perpetual fog that seemed to cling to this stretch of coastline. "When was the last time this thing actually worked?" Morrison asked, adjusting his collar against the biting wind. Dr. Catherine Webb, the marine biologist who had called in the report, checked her notes. According to the Coast Guard records, the Black Rock light was decommissioned in 1983. Electrical systems were completely removed. The lens assembly was supposed to be dismantled, but she gestured toward the lighthouse's crown. "As you can see, it's still there." Morrison squinted up at the lighthouse's peak. The enormous Fresnel lens caught what little daylight filtered through the clouds, creating an almost hypnotic pattern of refracted light. "So, what exactly did you see last night, Doctor?" Catherine's face paled slightly. "I was conducting a migration study about 2 miles offshore. The fog was particularly thick around midnight when suddenly—" She paused, seeming to struggle with the memory. The light came on, not the normal white beacon you'd expect from a lighthouse. This was different. Blood red. It swept across the water in slow, deliberate circles. Could have been a boat. Maybe someone anchoring near the rocks. "No." Catherine shook her head firmly. "I know every vessel that operates in these waters. This light was coming from the lighthouse itself. I'm certain of it." Morrison made a note in his pad. 3 fishing boats had gone missing in the past month, within a 10-mile radius of Black Rock Light. The Coast Guard had attributed the disappearances to the dangerous currents and hidden rocks that made this area a navigator's nightmare. But Catherine Webb's report suggested something else entirely. "There's more," Catherine continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "When the light was on, I heard something. A sound carried across the water. It was like someone screaming, but not quite human." The lighthouse door hung open on rusted hinges, creaking in the wind with a sound that made Morrison's teeth ache. The interior smelled of decay and salt water, with something else underneath. Something rotten. Catherine followed close behind as they climbed the narrow spiral staircase. Their flashlight beams danced across water-stained walls, where patches of mold had formed strange, almost deliberate patterns. Morrison counted 147 steps before they reached the lamp room at the top. Jesus, he breathed. The Fresnel lens dominated the circular room, but it wasn't the magnificent piece of 19th century engineering he'd expected. The lens was covered in a thin film of what looked like dried blood. Dark stains ran down its faceted surface in deliberate patterns, as if someone had painted symbols with their fingers. Catherine moved to examine the lens more closely. "James, look at this." Carved into the metal housing around the lens were names, dozens of them, scratched into the surface with what appeared to be fingernails rather than tools. William Torres, 1983. Jennifer Hansen, 1987. Michael Rodriguez, 1991. David Kowalski, 1995. Anna Johansson, 1999. The list continued, with names appearing every few years up until the most recent entry. Robert Chun, 2023. "These are the missing persons," Morrison realized, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Going back 40 years. Catherine ran her finger along one of the carved names. "But how could they have carved these here? The lighthouse has been abandoned all this time." A sound from below made them both freeze. Footsteps on the metal stairs, slow and deliberate. Morrison drew his weapon and motioned for Catherine to stay behind him. "Hello," he called down. "This is the police. Identify yourself." The footsteps stopped. Then, from the darkness below, came a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The light must shine." The man who appeared at the top of the stairs was barely recognizable as human. His clothes hung in tatters, his skin was pale and mottled with strange burns, and his eyes were completely white, as if the pupils had been burned away. But somehow, impossibly, he seemed to see them clearly. "You shouldn't be here," the man said in a voice like grinding glass. "Not when the fog comes. The light will call to you, and then you'll understand. You'll understand what we've become." Morrison kept his weapon trained on the figure. "What's your name?" "Thomas. Thomas Mitchell. I was the keeper here, before it all went wrong." Catherine gasped. "That's impossible. Thomas Mitchell disappeared in 1983. That was 40 years ago." The thing that called itself Thomas Mitchell smiled, revealing teeth that had turned completely black. "Time moves differently when you serve the light, when you become part of its purpose." "What purpose?" Morrison demanded. Thomas's head tilted at an unnatural angle. "The sea is angry. It has been for centuries. The ships that pass by this point, the lives lost to the rocks, the ocean remembers every soul that was taken. The light calls them home." The temperature in the room began to drop rapidly. Morrison could see his breath forming clouds in the increasingly frigid air. "At first, it was just one night," Thomas continued, his voice becoming more distorted with each word. "One night when the fog was thick and I thought I saw the light turn on by itself. But it wasn't electricity powering it. It was something else, something that had been waiting beneath the waves." The Fresnel lens behind Thomas began to emit a faint red glow. The first keeper to serve the light willingly was William Torres. He came here in 1983, just after I became something else. The light showed him the truth, the hunger of the sea, the need for payment. Morrison's radio crackled to life. "Unit 47, we have reports of a vessel in distress approximately 2 miles southeast of Black Rock Point. Dense fog is hampering rescue efforts." The red glow from the lens intensified. "Another offering," Thomas whispered, his white eyes reflecting the crimson light. "The sea calls, and we must answer." The fog rolled in with unnatural speed, surrounding the lighthouse in a matter of minutes. Through the lamp room windows, Morrison could see nothing but an impenetrable gray wall. The red light from the lens began to pulse in a rhythm that seemed to match his heartbeat. Catherine grabbed his arm. "We need to leave. Now." But as they turned toward the stairs, they found their path blocked. More figures had appeared in the lamp room, materializing from the shadows like smoke given form. Morrison recognized some of the faces from missing person reports. Jennifer Hansen, who had vanished during a solo sailing trip in 1987. David Kowalski, a marine biologist who had disappeared while studying the local ecosystem in 1995. Robert Chun, whose fishing boat had been found empty and drifting just 3 months ago. They all bore the same pale, mottled skin and those terrible white eyes. "The light needs tenders," Thomas explained, his voice now echoing with the sound of crashing waves. "Those who will ensure it continues to shine. Those who will help it feed." The red beam from the lens suddenly blazed to full intensity, cutting through the fog like a knife. In its crimson glow, Morrison could see something impossible. The ocean floor was visible through the water, as if the light had the power to make the sea itself transparent. And on that ocean floor, scattered among the rocks and coral, were the remains of hundreds of ships, vessels from every era, from wooden sailing ships to modern pleasure craft. Their broken masts reached up toward the surface like grasping fingers. "The hungry water," Catherine whispered, staring at the impossible sight. "That's what the old maritime records called this area. Ships have been wrecking here for over 2 centuries. Thomas nodded slowly. The sea remembers every life it has claimed, and now it wants payment. A life for every soul it has taken. The light calls them home, one by one. Outside, through the fog, they could hear the distant sound of a ship's engine growing closer. The vessel in distress was heading directly for the rocks, drawn by the lighthouse's deadly red beacon. Morrison raised his radio. "This is Unit 47. We need the Coast Guard to establish a safety perimeter around Blackrock Point immediately. There's a vessel heading into danger." Static answered him. The radio was dead. "No one can hear you," Thomas said with that horrible smile. "Not when the light shines. Not when the sea is feeding." The sound of the approaching vessel grew louder. Through the red-tinted fog, Morrison could make out the shape of a small yacht, its captain no doubt believing he was navigating toward safety. "We have to warn them," Catherine said, moving toward the lens. "Don't touch it." Thomas's voice rose to a shriek, but it was too late. Catherine's hands made contact with the bloody lens, and instantly her scream filled the lamp room. But even as she cried out in pain, her fingers began moving across the glass surface, tracing new symbols in the dried blood. "It burns," she gasped, but she couldn't pull her hands away. "But I can see everything. Every ship that ever passed this point. Every soul the sea has claimed." Morrison grabbed her shoulders, trying to pull her back from the lens. But the moment his skin made contact with hers, the visions hit him too. He saw the lighthouse in its glory days, its white beam guiding ships safely past the treacherous rocks. He saw the night in 1983 when something rose from the deepest part of the ocean, something ancient and hungry. He saw Thomas Mitchell, the last real lighthouse keeper, fighting desperately to keep the thing at bay before finally succumbing to its influence. And he saw the truth. The lighthouse hadn't been abandoned. It had been transformed into something else entirely. A beacon not for safety, but for sacrifice. The yacht struck the rocks with a sound like thunder. Even through the fog, they could hear the splintering of fiberglass and the terrified shouts of the crew. 3 people aboard, Morrison realized. A family on what was supposed to be a peaceful evening cruise. "Help them," he pleaded with the assembled figures of the missing. "You were human once. You have to remember what it was like." Thomas shook his head sadly. "We remember everything, Detective. That's the curse. We remember being human, but we also understand the truth now. The ocean must be fed. The cycle must continue." The red light pulsed brighter, and Morrison could see shapes moving beneath the water around the wreck. Not sharks or fish, but something else. Pale forms with reaching arms, swimming up from the depths where the old shipwrecks lay. "The claimed ones," Catherine whispered, her voice now carrying the same ethereal quality as the others. "They've been waiting so long for company." Morrison realized with horror that Catherine was changing. Her skin was growing pale and mottled, and when she turned to look at him, her eyes had begun to cloud over with that terrible white film. "Fight it," he urged her. "You're still human. You can still choose. But why would I want to fight it? Catherine asked, tilting her head at the same unnatural angle as Thomas. I can see so clearly now. The pattern, the purpose. The sea has been patient, but its hunger grows stronger every year. The screaming from the wrecked yacht had stopped. The red light continued to pulse, calling to something deep beneath the waves. Your turn, detective, Thomas said, gesturing toward the lens. Touch it. See the truth. Join us willingly, and the transition will be less painful. Morrison backed toward the stairs, his weapon still drawn, though he suspected bullets would be useless against these things. There has to be another way. A way to break this cycle. The only way to break it, said a new voice from behind him, is to destroy the lens itself. Morrison spun around to see an elderly woman standing at the top of the stairs. Unlike the others, her eyes were normal, though filled with terrible sadness. Her clothes were modern, and she bore none of the supernatural pallor of the other figures. Who are you? Morrison demanded. My name is Margaret Torres. William was my husband. She looked at the figure that had been Thomas Mitchell. I've been searching for him for 40 years, following the stories, the disappearances. I finally understand what happened here. Margaret reached into her jacket and pulled out what looked like a small explosive device. Industrial thermite, she explained. Hot enough to melt that lens into slag. Margaret, no. The voice that spoke was different from Thomas's distorted tones. For a moment, the thing that had been the lighthouse keeper sounded almost human. If you destroy the lens, the sea's anger will have nowhere to focus. It will spread. Every coastal community for hundreds of miles will suffer shipwrecks, storms, disasters beyond imagining. That's a lie, Margaret replied firmly. I've spent 40 years researching this. The lens isn't containing anything. It's amplifying it, making the hunger stronger with each sacrifice. The red light began to pulse faster, and Morrison could feel something pressing against his mind. A terrible urge to walk to the lens, to place his hands upon its bloody surface, and join the eternal vigil. Catherine was no longer fighting the transformation. Her eyes were now completely white, and she moved with the same unnatural gait as the others. James, she said in a voice like distant waves, don't you want to understand? Don't you want to see the truth beneath the water? Morrison's hand began to move toward the lens, almost against his will. The red light was hypnotic, beautiful in its horror. He could see how easy it would be to simply give in, to become part of something larger than himself. Detective. Margaret's sharp voice cut through the supernatural compulsion. Remember why you came here. Remember the people who are counting on you to find the truth. Morrison shook his head, breaking free from the lens's influence. Do it, he told Margaret. Destroy that thing. Margaret activated the thermite device and hurled it at the base of the lens. The assembled figures of the missing let out a collective wail that seemed to shake the very foundations of the lighthouse. No, Thomas shrieked. You don't understand what you're doing. The compact, the bargain. The thermite ignited with a brilliant white flash that temporarily blinded everyone in the room. When Morrison's vision cleared, the Fresnel lens was nothing but molten glass and twisted metal. And then, something extraordinary happened. The fog began to lift, not gradually, as it normally would, but all at once, as if a great weight had been removed from the air. The red light was gone, replaced by ordinary moonlight streaming through the lamp room windows. One by one, the figures of the missing began to fade, but unlike the horrible dissolution Morrison had expected, they seemed to be dissolving into points of light, like stars being born. Thank you, William Torres whispered as his form became translucent. We can rest now. We can finally rest. Thomas Mitchell was the last to go. As his form began to fade, his eyes cleared for just a moment, returning to their natural brown color. Tell my family, he said in a voice that was purely human. Tell them I fought it as long as I could. Tell them I'm sorry. And then he was gone, leaving only Morrison and Margaret in the empty lamp room. The rescue boats found the survivors from the yacht clinging to debris near the rocks. All three made full recoveries, though they reported no memory of what had caused their boat to change course toward the lighthouse. The official report listed the incident as a navigation error caused by the unusual fog conditions. The lighthouse was finally condemned and sealed, its dangerous lens permanently removed. But Margaret Torres remained in the coastal town, opening a small maritime museum dedicated to the vessels lost in the waters around Black Rock Point. She never spoke publicly about what had happened that night, but those who visited her museum noted that she always seemed to be listening for something, as if waiting for a sound that never came. Detective Morrison returned to his regular duties, though he found himself drawn to the coast more often than before. On clear nights, he would drive out to the point and look toward the lighthouse, reassuring himself that it remained dark and silent. Catherine Webb was never found. The official report stated that she had fallen into the ocean during the rescue attempt, but Morrison knew better. He sometimes wondered if her transformation had been too far advanced to reverse, if she had become something that couldn't exist without the lens's power. The disappearances around Black Rock Point stopped completely after that night. Ships passed safely through waters that had been treacherous for over 2 centuries. The angry sea, it seemed, had finally been appeased. But on certain foggy nights, when the moon is dark and the wind carries strange sounds across the water, locals report seeing a faint blue light moving beneath the waves near the lighthouse. Not the malevolent red glow of the cursed lens, but something gentler, something that guides lost vessels away from the rocks instead of toward them. They say it's the spirits of the missing, finally free to serve their true purpose, not as servants of the sea's hunger, but as guardians of those who travel upon its surface. And in the deepest waters off Black Rock Point, where the ancient shipwrecks lie scattered across the ocean floor, there is peace at last. The dead sleep quietly in their watery graves, no longer tormented by an endless, impossible thirst. The light is dead, but the darkness holds no more terror. It holds only rest. The old lighthouse keeper's quarters hadn't been occupied in 17 years. That's what the real estate agent told Captain Theodore Blackwood when he signed the lease papers, with trembling hands that still remembered the rhythm of ship wheels and storm-tossed seas. The lighthouse stood on Beacon Point, a jagged outcrop of rock that jutted into the Atlantic like a broken finger pointing toward eternity. Theodore had spent 43 years sailing merchant vessels between Liverpool and Boston. His weathered face carried the salt of 1,000 storms, and his gray beard held secrets of nights when the ocean tried to claim him. Now, at 68, all he wanted was silence. Complete, absolute silence. The lighthouse seemed perfect. No neighbors for 3 miles. No traffic. No human voices. Just the eternal whisper of waves against granite and the occasional cry of seagulls. The tower rose 140 feet into the sky, its red brick exterior worn smooth by decades of coastal winds. Inside, a spiral staircase wound upward like a giant's corkscrew, leading to the lamp room where ships once found salvation in the darkness. On his first night, Theodore unpacked his few belongings in the keeper's cottage attached to the base of the tower. His naval trunk contained everything that mattered: his compass, a few books, his father's pipe, and a bottle of whiskey from his last voyage. He'd left behind 43 years of accumulated possessions, keeping only what could fit in one small room. The cottage was sparse but functional. Stone walls thick enough to muffle any sound from the outside world. A fireplace that drew well. Windows that faced inland, away from the hypnotic pull of the ocean. Theodore lit the fire, poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey, and settled into the only chair with his copy of Melville. Thud! The sound came from above, not from the cottage ceiling, but from somewhere higher up the tower. Theodore paused, his glass halfway to his lips. The lighthouse had been automated years ago. No one should be up there. Thud! Thud! Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps walking across the lamp room floor far above his head. Theodore set down his glass and listened. The footsteps moved in a slow circle, following the circumference of the round room. Around and around, like someone pacing. He waited for the steps to stop, but they didn't. They continued their circular path, with mechanical precision. Every 12 seconds, the same pattern. Step, 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 pause. Step, 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 pause. Theodore grabbed his flashlight and walked outside. He craned his neck upward, but the lamp room windows were dark. No beam swept across the waters tonight. The lighthouse hadn't been operational since the Coast Guard installed the automated beacon on the pier. The footsteps continued above him, muffled but unmistakable. Back inside, Theodore poured another drink. Perhaps it was the building settling. Old structures made strange noises. He'd heard plenty of them during his years at sea. The way ship hulls groaned and creaked in the night. This was no different. But as the hours passed, the footsteps never stopped. They maintained their rhythm with the precision of a metronome. Around and around, that slow, measured pace. Theodore tried to read, but the words blurred together. He tried to sleep, but every 12 seconds brought the same sequence of sounds from above. At dawn, the footsteps stopped. Theodore climbed the spiral staircase to investigate. The iron steps rang under his boots as he ascended, each footfall echoing in the hollow tower. Round and round he climbed, following the curve of the wall, until he reached the lamp room at the top. The circular room was empty except for the massive lens assembly in the center. Dust covered everything. No footprints marked the floor. The windows offered a panoramic view of the Atlantic, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Theodore examined every inch of the room. No signs of disturbance. No explanation for the sounds he'd heard. He descended the stairs with more questions than answers. The second night brought the same phenomenon. As darkness fell, the footsteps began. That same circular pattern. That same 12-second rhythm. Theodore timed them with his pocket watch. Never a variation. Never a misstep. He climbed the stairs twice during the night, but each time he found the lamp room empty and undisturbed. The moment he began his descent, the footsteps resumed above him. By the third night, Theodore had developed a theory. The automated systems must be malfunctioning. Perhaps some mechanical component was cycling on and off, creating the illusion of footsteps. He would contact the Coast Guard in the morning and have them inspect their equipment. But as he lay in bed that night, listening to the eternal circling above his head, Theodore realized something that made his blood run cold. The automated beacon was mounted on the pier, not in the lighthouse. There were no mechanical systems running in the lamp room. The footsteps were something else entirely. On the fourth night, Theodore decided to take action. If someone was playing an elaborate prank, he would catch them in the act. He gathered rope, pulleys, and every tool he could find. Working through the afternoon, he rigged a system of ropes and bells that would alert him to any attempt to enter the lighthouse from outside. Then he went further. He nailed boards across the door that led from the cottage into the tower, heavy planks secured with 6-inch nails. No one could enter the tower without making tremendous noise. As sunset approached, Theodore positioned himself in his chair with a clear view of the blocked doorway. His flashlight lay ready on the table beside him. He would solve this mystery tonight. Darkness fell. The cottage grew quiet except for the distant murmur of waves against rock. Then the footsteps began. Above his head, in the sealed tower, something walked its endless circle. Step, 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 pause. Step, 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 pause. The same 12-second rhythm, as precise as ever. Theodore stared at the blocked doorway. The boards hadn't moved. The bells on his outside rigging remained silent. Whatever was making those sounds had not entered through any earthly door. His hands shook as he poured whiskey into his glass. The amber liquid sloshed as the footsteps continued their patient circuit overhead. Around and around, hour after hour, like a century walking in eternal watch. Theodore had sailed through hurricanes that split ships in half. He navigated by dead reckoning through fogs so thick he couldn't see his own hands. He'd watched men disappear into waves as tall as buildings and never show fear to his crew. But now, sitting in his chair with his back to the wall and his eyes fixed on the barricaded door, Captain Theodore Blackwood felt terror crawling up his spine like ice water. The footsteps were inside the tower. inside the sealed, empty tower, and they would not stop. As the night wore on, Theodore became aware of something else. The footsteps weren't just circling the lamp room anymore. They were moving down the spiral staircase, slowly, deliberately, descending one step at a time. Thud! The sound came from the step just below the lamp room. Thud! One step lower. Thud! Another step down. Theodore's breath came in short gasps. Whatever was in the tower was coming down toward him, step by step, following the spiral path that led directly to the cottage, to the blocked door, to him. He grabbed his flashlight and pointed it at the barricaded entrance. The beam shook as his hands trembled. The footsteps continued their descent, growing louder as they approached. Thud! 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 Now, they were halfway down the tower, still descending, still maintaining that mechanical 12-second rhythm that had haunted his nights. Theodore backed away from the door until he felt the far wall against his shoulders. The footsteps kept coming, down and down the spiral staircase, as inevitable as the tide. Thud! 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 Now, they were just a few steps above the cottage level. Theodore could hear them clearly through the thick stone walls. Heavy boots on iron steps. Getting closer. The footsteps reached the bottom of the staircase and stopped. Silence filled the cottage like a held breath. Theodore waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. The blocked doorway remained sealed. Nothing moved in the lamplight. Then he heard it. A slow, deliberate knocking on the other side of the barricaded door. 3 measured knocks, spaced exactly 4 seconds apart. Then silence. Theodore stared at the boards he'd nailed across the entrance. The wood was solid. The nails were deep. Nothing could get through. The knocking came again. 3 knocks, 4 seconds apart. Patient and persistent. "Who's there?" Theodore called out, his voice cracking like a boy's. No answer. Just silence. Then the knocking resumed. The same pattern. 3 knocks, pause. 3 knocks, pause. Over and over, with mechanical precision. Theodore realized he was trapped. Whatever wanted to enter the cottage would keep knocking until he opened the door. And if he opened the door, he would face something that had no earthly explanation. The knocking continued through the night. Theodore sat in his chair, clutching his flashlight, watching the barricaded door shake slightly with each impact. The nails held firm, but the patient persistence of those knocks wore at his sanity like water wearing at stone. At dawn, the knocking stopped. Theodore waited until full sunlight streamed through his windows before approaching the door. With trembling hands, he pried away the boards and nails. The door swung open to reveal the empty staircase beyond. No footprints in the dust. No signs of disturbance. But carved into the stone wall beside the door, fresh and deep as if cut with a chisel, were 3 words that made Theodore's blood turn to ice. "Welcome home, Keeper." That morning, Theodore packed his naval trunk and left Beacon Point forever. The lighthouse stands empty once again, waiting for the next soul who seeks silence in its hollow chambers. The real estate listing is still active. The rent is remarkably cheap for a property with such spectacular ocean views. But the listing doesn't mention the footsteps that circle the lamp room every night, or the knocking that follows them down the spiral stairs. It doesn't mention the words carved in stone, or the presence that has been walking those stairs far longer than any living memory can recall. Some silences, Theodore learned too late, are not empty at all. They are full of things that should have been forgotten long ago. The ancient lighthouse of Beacon Point had stood sentinel over the treacherous North Atlantic waters for over 2 centuries. Its weathered stone walls had witnessed countless storms, shipwrecks, and tragedies that would make even the bravest souls tremble with fear. Dr. James Morrison, a renowned maritime historian from Edinburgh, had traveled to this remote Canadian coastal village with one purpose: to uncover the truth behind the most haunting mystery in lighthouse-keeping history. The locals whispered about it in hushed tones, crossing themselves whenever the tale was mentioned. But James was a man of science, and he refused to believe in ghost stories. The year was 2012, exactly 100 years since lighthouse keeper Thomas Whitmore had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only his logbook and a mystery that had plagued the community for generations. James had rented a small cottage near the lighthouse from Mrs. Catherine O'Brien, an elderly woman whose family had lived in the village for 4 generations. Her weathered face carried the weight of secrets, and her pale blue eyes held shadows that seemed to dance with unspoken knowledge. "You shouldn't have come here in October," she warned him on that first evening, as autumn winds howled outside her kitchen window. "The full moon brings her back. Every October, just like it did that terrible night in 1912. James smiled politely, setting down his teacup. "Mrs. O'Brien, I appreciate the local folklore, but I'm here to research historical facts. Thomas Whitmore's disappearance was likely due to the severe storm that hit the coast that week. Perhaps he fell from the lighthouse during his duties." The old woman's face grew grave. "You don't understand, Dr. Morrison. Thomas didn't just disappear. He was taken by his wife, Elizabeth. But according to the records, Elizabeth Whitmore died 3 months before her husband vanished. She drowned in a boating accident." Mrs. O'Brien's hands trembled as she reached for her rosary. "That's what they wrote in the official reports. But those of us who lived through it, we know the truth. Elizabeth Whitmore didn't drown that day. Something else happened to her out there in the dark waters. Something that changed her, made her into something that wasn't quite human anymore." The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers trying to claw their way inside. James felt an unexpected chill run down his spine, but he attributed it to the draft. "Tell me what really happened," he said, leaning forward with academic curiosity. Mrs. O'Brien's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Elizabeth was a beautiful woman, with long auburn hair and the most mesmerizing green eyes you'd ever seen. She and Thomas were deeply in love, married just 2 years when tragedy struck. Elizabeth had taken their small boat out to collect mussels from the rocks near Devil's Teeth, those jagged stones about a mile offshore." She paused, her fingers working nervously through the rosary beads. "When she didn't return by sunset, Thomas lit every lamp in the lighthouse and kept the beam sweeping the waters all night. The next morning, they found her boat, empty, floating near the rocks. But they never found her body." James scribbled notes in his journal. "That's consistent with the historical records. The official cause of death was listed as accidental drowning." "Accidental," Mrs. O'Brien repeated bitterly. "If only it had been that simple." For 3 months after Elizabeth's death, Thomas grieved like a man possessed. He barely ate, barely spoke to anyone in the village. He just tended to his lighthouse duties and stared out at the sea, waiting, always waiting. The old woman stood and walked to the window, peering out at the lighthouse that loomed in the distance, its beam cutting through the October darkness like a sword of light. Then came the night of October 13th, 1912. The full moon hung over Beacon Point, like a pale eye watching everything below. My grandmother was just a young girl then, but she remembered every detail of that night until the day she died. James felt the hairs on the back of his neck begin to rise, though he couldn't explain why. What happened? Around midnight, people in the village began to see a figure walking along the shore. A woman in a white dress, with long hair flowing behind her like seaweed. At first, they thought their eyes were playing tricks on them, but as she drew closer to the lighthouse, they realized who it was. Mrs. O'Brien turned from the window, her face pale in the lamplight. It was Elizabeth Whitmore, but she was different. Her skin was white as bone, and her eyes... She shuddered. Her eyes were like dark pools of the deepest ocean, and when she walked, she left no footprints in the sand, but the ground beneath her feet turned cold and wet, as if the sea itself was following her. James tried to maintain his scholarly skepticism, but something in the old woman's voice made his rational mind waver. Surely it was just someone who resembled her, perhaps playing a cruel prank. That's what Thomas thought when he saw her approaching the lighthouse. He ran down from the lamp room, his heart pounding with joy and disbelief. The villagers watched from their windows as he flung open the lighthouse door and called out to her. Mrs. O'Brien's voice began to shake, but when Elizabeth spoke, When she answered him, her voice carried the sound of drowning waves and dying winds. She called to him in words that seemed to come from the depths of the ocean itself. "Come with me, my love," she said. "Come with me to the place where the water never ends, where we can be together forever in the cold embrace of the deep." The wind outside suddenly died to an eerie calm, and James noticed that the lighthouse beam had stopped its rotation, pointing directly toward Mrs. O'Brien's cottage like an accusing finger. Thomas walked toward her as if he was in a trance. She continued. The villagers shouted warnings, but he couldn't hear them, or wouldn't. Elizabeth reached out her hand to him, and even from their windows, people could see that her fingers were webbed, and her skin had a sickly green tint, like something that had been underwater for too long. James's pen had stopped moving across his notebook. Despite himself, he was completely absorbed in the tale. They walked together toward the shore, Thomas and the thing that had once been his wife, and as they reached the water's edge, Elizabeth began to change before everyone's eyes. Her white dress became like mist and foam, and her body seemed to dissolve into the waves. But she maintained her grip on Thomas, pulling him deeper and deeper into the frigid water. Mrs. O'Brien sat back down, her hands trembling violently now. The last thing the villagers saw was Thomas's head disappearing beneath the surface. The lighthouse beam swept over the water one final time, and then went dark. When the authorities arrived the next morning, they found the lighthouse empty, with Thomas's logbook open to his final entry. "What did it say?" James asked, his voice barely audible. "Just 4 words, written in a shaking hand. She has returned home." James felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. The rational part of his mind insisted this was just an elaborate local legend, but something deeper, something primal, was telling him there was truth in this tale. "But that's not the end of the story, Dr. Morrison," Mrs. O'Brien said, her eyes now fixed on his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "Every October, when the full moon rises over Beacon Point, Elizabeth returns. She walks the shore, searching for someone else to join her and Thomas in their watery grave." As if summoned by her words, a low moan echoed from somewhere outside, a sound like wind through sea caves, but there was no wind. James and Mrs. O'Brien both froze, listening to the unnatural sound that seemed to come from the direction of the lighthouse. "She's coming," the old woman whispered. "I can feel her presence. Dr. Morrison, you must leave this place. Tonight, before the moon reaches its peak." James stood abruptly, his scientific training warring with a growing sense of dread. "This is ridiculous. I'm a rational man. I don't believe in ghosts." But even as he spoke, he could see through the window that a pale figure had appeared on the beach, moving slowly toward the lighthouse. The moonlight seemed to bend around the figure, creating an otherworldly glow that hurt to look at directly. "Look at her," Mrs. O'Brien commanded, grabbing James by the arm. "Look and tell me that's just a local woman playing dress-up." James squinted through the glass, and his blood turned to ice. The figure on the beach was indeed wearing a flowing white dress, but it moved in ways that defied natural laws. Sometimes it appeared solid, other times it seemed translucent, as if made of moonlight and sea foam. And as it drew closer, he could see that it left no footprints in the sand, but in its wake, the beach glistened with seawater that shouldn't have been there. The figure stopped directly in front of the lighthouse and slowly turned its head toward Mrs. O'Brien's cottage. Even from this distance, James could see 2 dark holes where the eye should have been, holes that seemed to contain the infinite depth of the ocean itself. "Oh God," he breathed, "it's looking right at us." The figure raised one pale arm and pointed directly at James, and suddenly the sound of crashing waves filled the cottage. Though the night remained perfectly calm outside, water began to seep under the front door, carrying with it the smell of decay and deep ocean trenches. "She wants you," Mrs. O'Brien gasped, backing away from the window. "She's chosen you to join them. You have to run, Dr. Morrison. Run now." But James found himself paralyzed, staring at the impossible figure on the beach. As he watched, Elizabeth Whitmore began to move toward the cottage, her feet never quite touching the ground. With each step, The water inside the house rose higher, and James could hear something else, voices calling to him from beneath the waves. The voices of Thomas and Elizabeth, and dozens of others, all the souls she had claimed over the past century. They were calling his name, beckoning him to join them in their eternal underwater embrace. James finally broke free from his trance and stumbled toward the back door. "This isn't possible," he muttered. "This can't be happening." But Mrs. O'Brien grabbed him before he could flee. "If you run, she'll only follow. There's one way to survive until dawn. In my bedroom, there's an old sea chest. Inside, you'll find Thomas Whitmore's final Lighthouse logbook, the real one, not the official record. Read the last entry aloud, and it will hold her at bay until the sun rises." James nodded frantically and ran toward the bedroom as the water in the cottage continued to rise. Behind him, he could hear the front door creaking open, though no hand had touched it. In the bedroom, he found the ancient sea chest and threw it open. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, was a water-stained logbook. He opened it to the final entry, dated October 13th, 1912, and began to read aloud in a shaking voice. "My beloved Elizabeth came to me tonight, but she is no longer the woman I married. The sea has claimed her soul and transformed her into something terrible and beautiful. She promises me eternal love in the depths, but I know now what she has become. I write this warning for anyone who may find it. Beware the keeper's wife, for she will not rest until she has claimed every soul on this cursed shore. May God have mercy on us all." As James finished reading, the rising water suddenly stopped, and the temperature in the cottage plummeted. Through the bedroom window, he could see Elizabeth standing in the doorway of the cottage, her hollow eyes fixed on him with rage and hunger, but she could come no closer. The power of Thomas's written warning held her back, creating an invisible barrier she could not cross. For hours, James sat in that bedroom, reading and rereading the logbook entry, while Elizabeth waited just outside, sometimes pacing, sometimes standing perfectly still, always watching. Mrs. O'Brien had vanished, and James suspected she had been part of Elizabeth's trap all along. Perhaps another victim from decades past, doomed to lure new souls to the keeper's wife. As the first rays of dawn began to pierce the October sky, Elizabeth let out a wail of frustration that shook the entire cottage. The sound was like 1,000 drowning voices crying out at once. Then, as the sunlight touched her ethereal form, she began to fade, becoming more and more transparent until she disappeared entirely. James collapsed with exhaustion and relief, clutching the logbook to his chest. When the sun was fully up, he staggered out of the cottage to find that it was completely dry inside, as if the supernatural flood had never happened at all. He packed his belongings immediately and left Beacon Point that very morning, never to return. But he kept Thomas Whitmore's logbook, and sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the ocean wind howls through his Edinburgh study, he takes it out and reads the final entry. Remembering the night, he almost joined the keeper's wife in her eternal underwater realm. The lighthouse at Beacon Point still stands today, automated now and requiring no human keeper. But the locals know better than to walk the shore when the moon is full in October, for that is when she returns. Elizabeth Whitmore, the keeper's wife, forever searching the dark waters for new souls to claim. And they say that if you listen carefully on those moonlit October nights, you can still hear Thomas calling out across the waves, warning travelers away from his beloved's deadly embrace, a lighthouse keeper's final duty that even death cannot end. The ancient stone walls of Beacon's Reach Lighthouse had weathered countless storms along the desolate Maine coastline. For over 150 years, this towering sentinel had guided ships through the treacherous waters, but tonight, it would become a prison of terror for 5 unsuspecting souls. Documentary filmmaker David Richardson adjusted his camera equipment as the October wind howled around the abandoned structure. The British filmmaker had traveled from London to capture the lighthouse's forgotten history, but he had no idea he was about to uncover something far more sinister than maritime tales. "The light's fading fast," called out his camera operator, Antoine Dubois, a seasoned Frenchman who had filmed in the most remote corners of the world. We should start setting up inside before we lose all visibility. Sound engineer Ingrid Larsson from Stockholm nodded in agreement, her blonde hair whipping in the fierce coastal wind. This storm is moving in faster than the weather reports predicted. We might be stuck here longer than planned. Their local guide, Charlotte Webb, a Maine native whose grandfather had been the last official keeper of the lighthouse, looked up at the darkening sky with growing concern. My grandfather always said October storms here are different, more dangerous. We should have waited for better weather. The fifth member of their crew, researcher Oliver Kane from Dublin, was already climbing the lighthouse stairs with his equipment. According to the historical records, this lighthouse was abandoned in 1962 after 3 keepers vanished within a 2-year period. The locals claimed it was cursed. David followed with his camera, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the gloom inside the circular stone structure. Perfect. That's exactly the kind of story our viewers want to hear. Mystery, history, and a touch of supernatural intrigue. But as they reached the lamp room at the top, Charlotte grabbed David's arm. There's something you need to know about this place. Something that historical records don't mention. Her voice carried a weight that made everyone stop what they were doing. What kind of something? David asked, his professional instincts sensing a compelling story element. Charlotte moved to the large windows that surrounded the lamp room, staring out at the rapidly approaching wall of fog that was rolling in from the Atlantic. In 1961, the year before the lighthouse was officially closed, my grandfather, Keeper William Webb, he started keeping a private log. Not the official one that the Coast Guard required, but a personal record of strange occurrences. The fog was moving with unnatural speed, engulfing everything in its path like a living entity. Within minutes, it had completely surrounded the lighthouse, cutting off all visibility beyond the windows. Strange how? Ingrid asked, setting up her audio equipment to record Charlotte's account. Ships would appear in the fog, old-fashioned vessels that shouldn't exist anymore. Sailing ships from the 1800s, sometimes even older. They would drift past the lighthouse in complete silence, and when my grandfather would try to signal them or make radio contact, they would simply vanish. Antoine was filming Charlotte's testimony when the fog suddenly pressed against the windows like thick liquid, blocking out even the faint moonlight. The lighthouse felt like it was being smothered. But the most disturbing entries in his private log, Charlotte continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, were about the fog itself. He wrote that on certain nights, particularly during October storms, the fog would move with purpose, with intelligence, and sometimes he could hear voices calling from within it. David felt his excitement building. This was exactly the kind of atmospheric detail that would make their documentary compelling. Did he ever record what these voices were saying? Charlotte's face went pale. Only once. On October 15th, 1961, exactly 62 years ago today, he wrote that the voices were warning him, telling him that something was coming with the fog, something that had been trapped in the mists for over a century, searching for a way back to land. As if summoned by her words, a low sound began to emanate from somewhere within the fog outside. It wasn't quite a moan, wasn't quite a whistle. It was something altogether more unsettling, like the dying breath of some massive creature. Oliver looked up from his research notes, his Irish accent thick with concern. Charlotte, what exactly happened to the 3 keepers who disappeared? The first one, in 1960, was found at the base of the lighthouse 3 days after he vanished. But here's what the official reports don't mention. He was completely dry. No signs of rain, sea spray, or moisture of any kind, even though there had been a massive storm that week. And his eyes were white, like he'd been blind for years. The sound from a fog grew louder, more insistent. Antoine trained his camera toward the windows, but the fog was so thick that the lens couldn't penetrate it at all. The second keeper disappeared 6 months later. Charlotte continued. They never found his body, but they found his clothes folded neatly at the edge of the rocky shore below. The clothes were bone dry, just like the first keeper's condition, and written in the sand near the clothes before the tide could wash it away. was a single word. Taken. Ingrid's audio equipment suddenly crackled with interference. "I'm picking up something," she said, adjusting her headphones. There are voices in the static, very faint, but definitely human voices. David moved closer to listen, but before he could put on the headphones, a sharp knock echoed from somewhere below them in the lighthouse. Everyone froze. "That came from the door," Oliver said, his voice barely audible. Another knock followed, slow, deliberate, patient. "Knock, knock, knock. There's no one out there," Antoine whispered, his camera still rolling. "The fog is too thick. No one could find the door in this." Charlotte's face had gone completely white. "My grandfather's final log entry. The one he wrote the night before he vanished," he said. "If the fog knocks, don't answer. Whatever is in the mist, it needs permission to enter. It needs to be invited in." The knocking continued, maintaining its slow, hypnotic rhythm. "Knock, knock, knock. We need to go down there," David said, his documentary instincts overriding his growing fear. "This could be the paranormal evidence we've been hoping for." "No." Charlotte grabbed his arm desperately. "You don't understand. My grandfather wrote about this exact scenario. He said that whatever lives in the fog, it's been waiting for the right combination of storm and moonlight and human presence to finally complete whatever business it left unfinished over a century ago." But David was already heading down the lighthouse stairs, his camera light bouncing off the curved stone walls. The others had no choice but to follow, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and the instinctive human need to stay together in times of danger. As they descended, the knocking grew louder and more insistent. But there was something else now, a voice calling from outside, a woman's voice, thin and desperate, speaking words they couldn't quite understand, but that filled them with an inexplicable sense of dread. "Please," the voice called through the thick wooden door. "I'm lost in the fog. I need shelter until morning. Please let me in." David reached for the door handle, but Charlotte lunged forward and grabbed his wrist. "Don't. That's not a person out there. My grandfather described this exact scene in his final entry. Something in the fog that imitates human voices, that pretends to need help." "You're being ridiculous," David said, but his voice lacked conviction. There was something about the voice outside that didn't sound quite right, something that made his skin crawl despite its apparent helplessness. The woman's voice came again, closer now, as if she was pressed against the door. "Please. I'm so cold. The fog, it's been following me for so long. I just need somewhere warm to wait out the storm." Antoine kept his camera trained on the door, and through his viewfinder, he noticed something that made his blood freeze. The thick wooden door was beginning to frost over. Ice crystals were forming around the edges, despite the fact that the October night was relatively warm. "The temperature's dropping," Ingrid reported, checking her equipment. "According to my instruments, it's fallen 20 degrees in the last 5 minutes." The voice outside changed, becoming more urgent, more demanding. "I know you're in there. I can hear you breathing. I can smell your fear. Let me in, and I promise I'll make it quick." That's when they all knew with absolute certainty that whatever was outside was not human. Oliver pulled out his smartphone to call for help, but the screen showed no signal. "We're completely cut off. No cell service, no radio contact." "The fog," Charlotte explained, her voice shaking. "My grandfather wrote that it interferes with all modern communication. It creates a dead zone where nothing can get in or out." The knocking stopped suddenly, and for a moment, they all hoped that whatever was outside had given up and moved on. But then they heard something far worse, the sound of footsteps circling the lighthouse. Slow, deliberate steps that shouldn't have been audible through the thick stone walls. "It's looking for another way in," Charlotte whispered. Grandfather's log mentioned windows on the lower level, windows that were bricked up years ago, but might not be completely sealed. As if to confirm her fears, they heard the sound of scraping from somewhere behind the walls. Something was testing the old masonry, looking for weak points. David finally understood the gravity of their situation. "We need to get higher in the lighthouse. Put as much distance between us and whatever's down here as possible. They began climbing the stairs again, but as they reached the second level, Ingrid suddenly stopped. "Listen," she hissed. From below them came a sound that chilled them to the bone, the creaking of the lighthouse door slowly opening. "But we never unlocked it," Antoine stammered. "I checked it myself when we arrived." "Some things don't need doors to be unlocked," Charlotte said grimly. "Some things have their own ways of getting what they want." They could hear it now, something moving inside the lighthouse with them. Wet, sliding sounds, as if whatever had entered was leaving a trail of seawater behind it. And with those sounds came a smell, the stench of things that had been underwater for far too long. "Up," David commanded. "Everyone up to the lamp room. Now." They climbed frantically, their flashlight beams dancing wildly on the walls. Behind them, the wet sliding sounds were getting closer, accompanied now by what sounded like labored breathing, if breathing was the right word for the horrible rasping that echoed up the lighthouse shaft. When they reached the lamp room, Oliver slammed the heavy door behind them and threw the bolt. For a moment, they all stood in the darkness, listening to their own terrified heartbeats. Then Charlotte spoke in a voice filled with terrible realization. "There's something else from my grandfather's log that I didn't tell you. Something about the lamp room itself." "What?" David demanded. "He wrote that this room, this is where it all started, where the curse began. In 1847, during a massive October storm just like tonight, the lighthouse keeper of that era, Edmund Blackwood, he made a terrible mistake. The wet sliding sounds had reached the door below them, and they could hear something testing the handle." "What kind of mistake?" Ingrid asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. "A ship appeared in the fog that night," Charlotte continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "An ancient vessel that should have been lost to history. The crew were calling for help, begging to be guided to shore. But Keeper Blackwood could see that something was wrong with them. Their voices carried too far in the fog. Their ship moved without wind or current." The handle of the lamp room door began to turn. He made the decision not to light the beacon, to let them pass by in the darkness rather than guide them to shore. But as their ship disappeared into the fog, he heard them cursing him, cursing this lighthouse and everyone who would ever work within it. The door opened slowly, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. But the smell that wafted up was overwhelming, the stench of drowning and decay, and things that should have remained buried beneath the waves. "They were the crew of the merchant vessel Redemption," Charlotte concluded, "lost at sea in 1803 with all hands. But according to my grandfather's research, they didn't just die that night, they became something else, something that exists in the fog between the world of the living and the dead." A figure began to emerge from the darkness below, tall, gaunt, wearing the tattered remains of a 19th century naval uniform. Its skin was gray-green and waterlogged, and its eyes were like black holes that seemed to contain the depths of the ocean itself. Behind it came others, the entire crew of the Redemption, preserved by their curse and their hatred for over 2 centuries. "We have waited," the first figure spoke, its voice like the sound of drowning. "Waited for the fog to be thick enough, the storm to be strong enough, the moon to be dark enough. Tonight, we finally claim what was denied to us so long ago." David backed against the lighthouse lamp, his camera still rolling despite his terror. "What do you want?" The ghostly figure smiled, revealing teeth like broken coral. "We want what every sailor wants, boy. We want to come home. And this lighthouse, this cursed beacon that denied us safe harbor, will finally guide us to shore." As the spectral crew advanced into the lamp room, Charlotte suddenly remembered something else from her grandfather's log. "Wait," she shouted. "There might be another way." She moved to a section of the floor that looked different from the rest, older, more worn. Grandfather wrote about a hidden chamber beneath the lamp room, the original keeper's quarters from when the lighthouse was first built. Oliver and Antoine helped her pry up the floorboards, revealing a narrow opening that led down into darkness. Without hesitation, they all climbed down into the hidden room, sealing the opening behind them just as the ghostly crew reached the lamp room floor above. The hidden chamber was small and cramped, filled with old furniture and maritime equipment from the 1800s. But what caught their attention was a collection of old lanterns arranged in a circle around what appeared to be human bones. "This must be where Keeper Blackwood made his final stand," Charlotte breathed. "Look, there's something written on the wall." In faded, desperate handwriting, they could read Edmund Blackwood's final message. "The fog brings them back, but only the living light can send them home. If you find this message, know that the lighthouse lamp above must burn with living flame, not electric bulb. Only then will their curse be broken." Above them, they could hear the ghostly crew searching, their waterlogged feet pacing back and forth across the lamp room floor. "Living flame," David repeated. "He means we need to actually light the lighthouse beacon, not with electricity, but with real fire." Ingrid picked up one of the old lanterns. "These still have oil in them. If we could get back up there." "We'll have to face them," Antoine said grimly. "All of us. There's no other way." Charlotte nodded, understanding what had to be done. "My grandfather's log said that the crew of the Redemption aren't evil, they're just lost. They've been trapped in the fog for over 2 centuries, unable to find their way to whatever comes after death. If we can light the beacon, if we can guide them home, maybe they'll finally find peace." One by one, they lit the old lanterns, the flames casting dancing shadows on the chamber walls. Then, with Charlotte leading the way, they climbed back up into the lamp room. The ghostly crew was waiting for them, but something had changed. The rage in their eyes had been replaced by something else. Hope, perhaps, or desperate longing. "You understand," the first figure said, his voice less threatening now. "You know what we need." Charlotte stepped forward, holding her lantern high. "You've been lost for so long. Let us help you find your way home." Working together, the living and the dead, they arranged the lanterns around the great lighthouse lens. As the flames grew brighter, the fog outside began to swirl and change, forming shapes and patterns that seemed almost like a pathway. The ghostly crew moved to the windows, their faces pressed against the glass, watching as the fog transformed. And then, impossibly, they could all see it, a spectral ship materializing in the mist, its sails billowing with otherworldly wind. "The Redemption," the ghost captain whispered. "Our ship, she's come back for us." One by one, the ghostly crew began to fade, their forms becoming more translucent as they were drawn toward their vessel. But before he disappeared entirely, the captain turned back to Charlotte. "Tell your grandfather's spirit," he said, "that we understand now. Keeper Blackwood made the right choice that night. Some things should not be guided to shore until they're ready to find their true home." As the last ghost faded away, the fog outside began to clear, revealing the dawn sky on the horizon. The supernatural storm was breaking up, and normal weather was returning to the coast. The 5 documentarians stood in the lamp room, exhausted but alive, watching as the ghostly ship sailed away into the lifting mist. Within minutes, it had disappeared entirely, taking with it over 2 centuries of curse and sorrow. David looked at his camera, realizing that he had captured something extraordinary. Not just a ghost story, but a tale of redemption and the power of understanding over fear. As they packed up their equipment and prepared to leave Beacon's Reach Lighthouse, Charlotte found one final entry in her grandfather's hidden log, an entry she had never seen before, written in fresh ink despite being in a book that was decades old. "The fog keepers have found their way home at last. The warning is no longer needed. The lighthouse can rest in peace." And as they walked away from the ancient tower, the morning sun finally breaking through the last wisps of supernatural effigy, they all knew they had witnessed something that would stay with them forever. The night they helped lost souls find their way to whatever lies beyond the veil between life and death. The lighthouse at Beacon's Reach still stands today, no longer haunted by the crew of the Redemption. But locals say that on clear October nights, if you look out over the water, you can sometimes see a ghostly ship sailing peacefully toward the horizon, finally home after more than 2 centuries of wandering in the fog.